This is not the story of a queen born to rule. It's the story of a survivor, born into a dynasty of snakes, scholars, and soldiers, all coiled on the banks of the Nile. Subscribe to follow the journey of a woman who fought her way through a dynasty of snakes, and the comments share whether you feel drawn more to her courage or to the danger around her. Before she was a legend, Cleopatra was a target. A girl whose family tree was watered with the blood of Alexander the Great, but whose every move was watched, judged, and challenged. Her family, the Ptolemies, were outsiders, Greeks ruling as Egyptian pharaohs, and this clash of worlds wasn't just her inheritance. It was her training ground. And the lessons she learned there would either get her killed or make her the most powerful woman on earth. To understand her, you have to imagine her city, Alexandria. This was no dusty capital, it was the beating heart of the Mediterranean. A crossroads where knowledge, money, and ambition collided on every corner. In its streets, the world gathered, and a young princess learned her first lesson: power doesn't reside in a crown, but at the center of the web. The library, the museums, the temples. These weren't just buildings, they were pieces on a global chessboard, and she was learning how to play. Her family's story began with one of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy I, who took Egypt and forged a dynasty that would last 300 years. But how do you hold power when you're not from there? You do it by becoming a master of disguise. The Ptolemies ruled as Greek kings in private, with their language and customs, but they dressed in the robes of pharaohs in public, participating in ancient rituals. Cleopatra was born into this duality, learning that image isn't vanity, it's a weapon. Life in the palace was a masterclass in politics. There were no secrets for the royal children. Cleopatra watched her father negotiate with foreign envoys, saw spies whisper in the corridors, and learned that a kingdom is held together as much by wheat as by mercenaries. She was a silent apprentice in the world's most dangerous game, watching alliances form and break, loyalties being bought, and how one wrong word could cost a head. Her education was brutally comprehensive. She didn't just study philosophy, mathematics, and Greek rhetoric, the tools of a Hellenistic ruler. She was trained in the art of diplomacy, coinage, and, crucially, public performance. But unlike her ancestors, she did something no one expected. She learned the language of her people. She learned Egyptian. This seemingly small decision would give her an advantage her rivals never saw coming. Egypt had known queens before. Women who ruled as goddesses on earth, figures of immense religious and political power. Cleopatra didn't see a glass ceiling, she saw a precedent. She saw a path to a power that fused the sacred and the secular, a power that would make her not just a queen, but an icon. But family was a minefield. The Ptolemaic dynasty was notorious for its betrayals. Siblings weren't playmates, they were potential rivals, pawns in a struggle for the throne that had no rules. Marriages were made to consolidate power, not for love. Cleopatra learned from childhood that affection is a luxury and loyalty is a commodity. The first rule of her house was simple: trust no one. Her father, Ptolemy XII, taught her a vital lesson in the fragility of power. He ruled by bribing the rising superpower, Rome, and by juggling the local elites who despised him. Cleopatra absorbed every detail. She saw that the throne was not a seat of stone, but a web of threads that could snap at any moment, and that survival depended on knowing which threads to cut and which to pull. The palace was not just a school of politics, but of seduction. Not romantic seduction, but the seduction of the masses. She learned how an elaborate banquet, an exotic perfume, or a perfectly timed festival could communicate more power than any decree. She learned to captivate, to manufacture prestige, to be unforgettable. She understood that people don't follow a ruler, they follow a spectacle, an idea, an emotion. But behind the spectacle, there was a mind as sharp as a razor. Her erudition was said to be exceptional, an intellect that intimidated the wisest of men. She wasn't just a pretty face, she devoured philosophy, debated with physicians and mathematicians. Her knowledge wasn't a hobby, it was a strategy. A ruler who could think across cultures could dominate a kingdom caught between them. And then there was her secret weapon, language. Reports say Cleopatra spoke 9 languages. This wasn't to impress at dinner parties. It allowed her to speak directly to her subjects, to negotiate with ambassadors without interpreters. In a world of whispers and translations, her voice was direct, clear, and unfiltered. It gave her a power and a respect that money couldn't buy. She was the only ruler who could speak to her people in their own tongue. The Egypt of her youth was a mosaic of cultures: Egyptians, Greeks, Phoenicians, Syrians, Africans. Each group had its own loyalties and demands. Cleopatra learned that to rule was not to command, but to mediate. She understood the practical levers of power, the flow of grain, taxes, public works. She knew what kept people fed up and what kept them loyal. And she knew the loyalty of the people was her ultimate shield. Religion was the operating system of power. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were economic centers that controlled land and labor, the heart of local communities. By participating in Egyptian rites, by aligning herself with the ancient gods, Cleopatra wasn't just showing piety. She was hacking the system, binding the loyalty of the people to her own person through the language of the sacred. The women of the court taught her another form of power, the power of networks. Queens and royal sisters wove alliances through marriages, favors, and ceremonies. Cleopatra learned that a whispered word could be more effective than a shouted order. She learned the art of subtle influence. As she grew, the shadow of Rome lengthened across the Mediterranean. Rome wasn't yet the empire it would become, but its generals and senators could already change the fate of kingdoms with a snap of their fingers. Cleopatra watched, learning that Egypt's independence was played out as much on the negotiating tables of Rome as on the battlefield. The world was bigger than Egypt, and she needed to master it. Succession was a bloody business. The practice of having co-regents often created rival power centers within the same palace, a recipe for civil war. Cleopatra witnessed how military commanders or wealthy citizens could tip the scales. She learned the art of political timing, when to be patient, and when to launch a risky, decisive strike. As she matured, the court began to notice her. She wasn't just a princess, she was a player. She showed a talent for finance and diplomacy that surpassed her brothers. Her competence was a threat. But recognition always attracts 2 things, allies and enemies. And Cleopatra began to accumulate both, people who saw in her the salvation of Egypt, and people who saw their own ruin. When the time for succession came, the pressure cooker of Ptolemaic politics exploded. The death of a sovereign was an invitation to chaos. For Cleopatra, the path to the throne was not a coronation, it was a war of negotiations, threats, and calculated moves. Her decision to fight for power was not just personal ambition. It was a strategic response to the threats facing Egypt. The grain of the Nile was vital to Rome, and a weak Egypt would be devoured. A leader was needed who could command respect both at home and abroad. Cleopatra believed that she alone could be that leader, and she was willing to do anything to prove it. She forged alliances within her own family, even when it required impossible compromises. Marriages between close relatives were political tools, and Cleopatra used them to solidify her claims and keep rivals in check. She understood that blood ties could be both a blessing and a death sentence. Her public image was her first campaign. She blended Hellenic elegance with Egyptian religiosity, creating a visual identity that appealed to multiple audiences. The portraits, the coins, the clothes. Nothing was casual. It was a visual rhetoric that declared her legitimacy. The coins were her billboards. They circulated through every level of society, a daily reminder of who was in charge. When Cleopatra took control of the mint, it was a declaration of sovereignty. She was putting her face in the pocket of every merchant and every farmer. But a kingdom is not ruled by images, but by administration. And the bureaucracy of Egypt was a complex machine of land records, taxes, and grain shipments. Cleopatra immersed herself in these details, ensuring the state kept running. Her competence in these mundane matters was the foundation of her power. The army was the final piece on the board. Their loyalty was bought with money and promises of glory. Cleopatra dedicated herself to cultivating the support of key commanders, offering rewards and proving she could win the respect of foreign powers. She understood that diplomacy and war were two sides of the same coin. And always, religion. By participating in the rites of the temples and aligning herself with goddesses like Isis, she became the embodiment of protection and divine order. It wasn't just politics, it was the creation of a myth in real time, a story her people longed to believe. Her court became a magnet for the intellectuals of the Mediterranean. But it wasn't for the love of art. Attracting philosophers and scientists gave her prestige and access to information networks. Cleopatra used knowledge as a form of soft power, turning intellectual capital into political capital. Diplomacy was her stage. She knew how to mix realism and theatricality. She understood that the perception of strength could deter aggression and that a well-publicized alliance could open trade routes. Her success was measured in bustling ports and secure borders. The Nile itself was her silent partner. Whoever controlled the grain controlled power. Cleopatra's attention to irrigation projects and granaries showed she understood the material reality that underpinned political stability. A sovereign who could guarantee the food supply could silence dissent. She sponsored festivals and art, not out of vanity, but to weave a narrative of continuity and prosperity around her rule. These acts created jobs, sparked celebrations, and built a cultural memory that would bolster her legitimacy long after she was gone. Her curiosity was insatiable. She surrounded herself with scholars, physicians, and advisors, expecting rigorous information and practical solutions. Her policy decisions reflected a deep knowledge of her kingdom's resources, trade patterns, and population needs. She kept the peace on her borders not just with armies, but with a network of treaties, marriages, and alliances with neighboring states. Her regional diplomacy showed she understood that Egypt's prosperity depended on having stable neighbors, not subservient ones. Economic policy was another of her strengths. She balanced the state's revenues from trade and taxes in a way that avoided suffocating the populace. Her focus on protecting the trade routes that brought wealth to Alexandria was the financial foundation that allowed her to play on the grand chessboard of the Mediterranean. The personal magnetism the ancients spoke of wasn't magic, it was a cultivated style. Her ability to converse, to charm, and to persuade came from a sharp intelligence and a psychology perfected in the jungle of the court. She used conversation as a political tool, winning favors and shaping perceptions, one encounter at a time. But the threat was constant. Rivals, resentful courtiers, foreign powers. Every triumph was tinged with danger. Her rise to power involved both prudence and calculated risk-taking. This awareness of danger kept her politically nimble, always ready to adapt. She adopted the symbols of the pharaonic monarchy, the rituals, the regalia, not as ornaments, but as connectors to the past. This assured many Egyptians that, though she was Greek, she honored the traditions of the land. She created a public identity that spoke fluently both the language of Egypt's past and the cosmopolitan present. The court was a web of favors and obligations, and Cleopatra was a master at distributing them. She used appointments, land grants, and privileges to build a network of loyalty that sustained her position. She balanced the rewards to ensure no one accumulated enough power to challenge her. She kept the army loyal and well paid, understanding that military competence bolstered her diplomatic standing. A strong army was a deterrent and an asset in negotiations. It allowed her to invoke force when necessary to protect Egyptian interests. She cultivated relationships with the economic elites, offering protections in exchange for loyalty and fiscal stability. By managing their interests, she reduced the risk of internal factions that could fragment the kingdom. Her own household became a microcosm of her rule, disciplined, competent, and with a sense of public duty. The efficient management of her court was a signal to foreign observers that her authority was stable and secure. She learned to speak not just to the elites, but to the common people. She used public appearances and festivals to align her goals with popular expectations, creating the image of an attentive ruler. This connection with the populace added a layer of resilience to her power. She maintained informal but effective intelligence networks. Courtiers, merchants, and foreign informants brought her news and rumors that allowed her to anticipate threats and opportunities. She acted on reliable information to preempt conspiracies. Art and architecture were tools of the state. She commissioned works that fused Egyptian and Hellenistic styles, reinforcing her dual identity. These projects not only beautified the capital but also created jobs and narrated the legitimacy of her dynasty in the urban landscape. Her maritime strategy is often overlooked, but it was crucial. Control of the sea lanes ensured trade and defense. She invested in the fleet and the ports, recognizing that Egypt's economic stability depended on its power at sea. Her early dealings with Rome taught her how to negotiate with an unpredictable and increasingly powerful republic. She learned to read the ambitions of Roman leaders, seeking ways to protect Egypt's autonomy while benefiting from peace. This strategic sensitivity would be the foundation of her future, famous encounters. The stability of the borders was a priority. She fostered treaties and alliances with tribal groups and neighboring kingdoms to reduce conflict and promote cooperation, ensuring Egypt remained a hub of exchange rather than a battlefield. She supported reforms in the judicial system to improve the administration of justice. Credible courts maintained social order and protected property rights, which in turn bolstered the economic and political stability that sustained her rule. Her private life and personal relationships were always intertwined with her public responsibilities. She navigated these relationships with the same political awareness she applied to the state, knowing that private choices often had massive public consequences. The need for heirs was a matter of state. Planning the succession and presenting her children in the royal narrative were calculated moves to ensure the dynasty's long-term survival. She used religious festivals and endowments to the temples to create networks of loyalty with the powerful priesthoods. These alliances secured her the support of institutions that held immense influence over local communities, fusing religion and politics into a solid foundation for her power. The cultural aura of her court, filled with scholars and artists, was not just for enrichment. It created networks of influence that extended into other courts. Intellectual prestige became an asset in diplomatic relations, elevating Egypt's status abroad. She developed a keen sense of rhetorical timing, knowing when to make a dramatic entrance and when to govern quietly from behind the scenes. She balanced spectacle with substance, combining public displays with solid administrative competence to win both the imagination and the confidence of her subjects. Her rise was not a single stroke of luck, but a series of calculated risks and incremental consolidations of authority. Each decision built upon the last, alliances secured, economic measures implemented, rituals performed. It was an ascent born of patience, intelligence, and an unerring sense of timing. At the end of this first stage, the image of Cleopatra as an intentional and skillful leader was already forged. The queen who now ruled had synthesized her Hellenic education, Egyptian ritual, and economic competence into a unique style of kingship. Her ascent was not the product of inheritance, but of design. The world she inherited was complex and fragile. Her early years of rule showed she was acutely aware of this. She worked to balance tradition with innovation, to use image and policy in concert, and to build networks of loyalty. In these formative years, she became not just a queen by birth, but a sovereign by right, poised to steer her kingdom through the turbulent decades ahead. As she became more than a queen, she shaped a future. Subscribe and share in the comments. Does her story move you more because of her courage to innovate or her skill at holding the old world together? Caesar, for his part, rewarded Cleopatra with political recognition and material support that helped to consolidate her hold over Egypt. He intervened in local affairs, dismissed the most dangerous rivals, and left enough of his authority that Cleopatra could return to Alexandria with bolstered legitimacy. Yet every act of assistance he offered also carried a cost, dragging Roman politics into the intimate theater of Ptolemaic rule and fueling whispers of improper influence among his opponents. When Cleopatra traveled to Rome, a journey that marked the strange intimacy of their alliance, she brought with her the spectacle of Egypt, garments that gleamed like sunlight on the Nile, servants who moved with a choreography foreign to Roman neighborhoods, and an entourage that turned streets into processions. Romans saw in her both the allure of the East and the threat of a foreign monarch in their midst. To Caesar's adversaries, her presence was a weapon they could use to paint him as a ruler susceptible to exotic seduction and monarchical ambitions. Inside Rome, the couple's connection played out on stages both public and private. Caesar staged triumphs and celebrations that blended Roman triumphal tradition with the majesty of his Egyptian ally, and Cleopatra's visits to his household were interpreted as declarations of influence, not merely affection. Yet amid the pomp, real governance continued. Land distributions, citizen lists, and laws moved beneath the surface, shaped in part by the stability that the alliance promised. Rumor amplified everything about them, and rumor is often an engine of politics in societies where appearance is power. Romans liked a narrative of morality to measure their leaders, and they fretted over the idea that Caesar's heart and judgment might be swayed by a foreign queen. Cleopatra's portrayal shifted depending on the storyteller, and she became a canvas upon which anxieties about gender, empire, and cultural mixing were vividly painted. Yet history remembers that their bond was not reducible to scandal and spectacle alone. It involved intimate conversations about governance and the logistics of empire, about the movement of ships and grain, about alliances with kings and the loyalty of troops. Cleopatra proved herself a shrewd interlocutor and partner in enterprise, someone who could make long-term calculations about trade routes and troop quarters as deftly as she handled courtly ceremony. Caesar, for his part, was a man who believed in his destiny and moved to realize it through transformative laws and military campaigns. He was not merely in Egypt for romance, he was building an edifice of authority that would outlast him, and Cleopatra's Egypt was a brick in that construction. Their alliance helped to anchor his reach into the East and offered a proof of his capacity to reorganize the ancient map under his influence. The balance between love and power remained delicate, and it was tested repeatedly by the needs of both parties. Cleopatra sought assurances that her dynasty would survive beyond the deaths of any single ally, while Caesar needed to justify his actions to Roman elites who feared the concentration of power. Each gesture, anointing, coinage, public appearances, private letters, was calibrated to signal a kind of permanence without provoking open revolt. Their lives were shot through with paradoxes that revealed the human side of statesmanship. In private moments, they could share laughter and confidences born of long nights of counsel, yet their policies could require ruthlessness against those they called friends. In moments of intimacy, they could contemplate a quieter future, and in moments of strategy, they plotted the future of an entire region. Power, for them, was never separate from personal affection. It flowed into it and was transformed by it. The contours of their domestic life became matters of international attention because of what a household signified in antiquity. Kingship was a private function with public consequences. The bedroom often served as a council chamber and a throne room. Naming a child, choosing a tutor, deciding whom to marry, all of these decisions were nodes where affection and statecraft intersected, and each was scrutinized by courtiers and foreign envoys alike. Even as they pursued their shared interests, both Cleopatra and Caesar were conscious of the narratives they wanted to craft about themselves. Cleopatra wanted to be seen as the continuation of a divine line, the embodiment of Egypt's ancient gods, and a sovereign whose rule was sanctioned by tradition. Caesar sought to be seen as a restorer of order and a man whose conquests and reconciliations served the public good, even as he bent institutions in pursuit of lasting influence. These competing narratives were not mere vanity. They shaped policy in concrete ways, such as how festivals were staged, how religious ceremonies were performed, and how taxation was administered. When Cleopatra stepped into a procession and the priests intoned chants, the message to the people was immediate and clear: Egypt's gods and Egypt's queen stood in continuity. When Caesar reformed urban administration in Rome, he was remaking the frame in which people would understand his rule. Their joint presence in Rome unsettled established political categories. Was Caesar acting as a Roman leader or an aspiring monarch? Was Cleopatra simply a client ruler or a sovereign equal? These questions had practical consequences, because Roman institutions were sensitive to any sign that power was consolidating in a way that might end the republic's accustomed balance. Senators warned of precedent, and opponents weaponized perception to mobilize resistance. In the streets and forums of Rome, Cleopatra's image was a lightning rod. Artists and playwrights found in her figure an irresistible subject, and poets indulged in metaphors that fused the exotic with the political. Sometimes she was praised for her regal poise, other times she was lampooned as a seductress with dangerous sway. The theater of public opinion became yet another arena in which their union was debated and mythologized. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra's rule had to be stable on the ground, not only credible in Rome. She negotiated with Egyptian elites, managed grain storage, and kept an eye on mercenary captains whose loyalties could be fickle. Her governance required a constant balance of ceremony and administration, of honoring age-old customs while also employing the innovations necessary to survive in a world dominated increasingly by Roman power. The environment of Alexandria itself shaped how power worked. This was a city where the lighthouse and library stood as symbols of human mastery over nature and knowledge, where harbors welcomed merchants from across the known world, and where temples echoed with centuries of ritual. Cleopatra understood that patronage of learning and religion would secure her reputation among the city's elite and assure the loyalty of populations whose identities were bound to place and custom. There are moments in history when a relationship becomes a hinge upon which events turn, and between Cleopatra and Caesar one can see such a hinge. Their partnership altered diplomatic alignments, shifted economic flows, and affected the stories told in both Eastern and Western courts. The ripple effects were felt in places as distant as the farms that supplied Rome's markets and the palaces where rival claimants gathered support. Yet for all the strategic logic, the human dimension cannot be ignored. Both felt attraction and companionship, both found in the other traits they admired and traits they feared. Cleopatra admired Caesar's capacity to reshape institutions and his hunger for achievement, while Caesar admired Cleopatra's determination and the elegance with which she navigated danger. They inspired loyalty in each other, a phenomenon that sometimes inflamed jealousy and suspicion among their entourages. Their alliance also had a theatrical quality that both of them appreciated. Celebratory rites, public audiences, and carefully staged appearances were crafted to send messages about their power and their unity. The optics mattered as much as the policies. A procession down the Royal Avenue or an invitation to dine could shift perceptions and recalibrate political equations. Power, in their hands, was performative as much as administrative. When Caesar returned to Rome, he brought with him not only memories but also objects that testified to their partnership, gifts that spoke of Egypt's material culture and artifacts that carried symbolic weight. Cleopatra's presence in his triumphs, whether real or imagined, made visible a new equation of influence that Rome could not ignore. Some Romans saw in these symbols the glory of a general whose reach crossed oceans, others saw the seeds of a new kind of rule. The son born of their union represented both a private joy and a public dilemma. To Cleopatra, Caesarion was a living anchor for her dynasty, a child who could carry both Ptolemaic and Roman legacies. To many Romans, however, he was a reminder of a potential shift in succession that could undermine Roman preeminence. Child and claim became a political fulcrum around which fears and hopes turned, and his existence magnified every decision the pair made. As their relationship matured, it became clear that neither could control every eventuality. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE shattered the climate they had been crafting and plunged the Mediterranean world into renewed turmoil. His death was an act of Roman domestic politics, the product of an elite sphere of monarchy, but its consequences spilled far beyond the city to touch Egypt, where Cleopatra suddenly found herself without the direct patronage of Rome's foremost man. In the immediate aftermath, Cleopatra's position wobbled like a reed in the tide. She moved quickly to secure her realm and to adjust the diplomatic landscape, shoring up alliances and making pragmatic choices that reflected the new reality. The politics of survival required a deft touch. She sought to maintain favorable relations with Rome even as she recalibrated her own authority in a world where Caesar's protective shadow had vanished. Rome's internal convulsions opened opportunities for rivals and created space for new actors to assert themselves. Antony and Octavian emerged as competing poles in the fight to inherit Caesar's mantle, and their quarrels would soon intersect with Cleopatra's fortunes. The alliances she had forged under Caesar's aegis were tested, and she had to decide how to align herself in a tumultuous and uncertain Mediterranean. Throughout this period, Cleopatra demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. She used diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the projection of imperial ritual to maintain her sovereignty. At times she played the role of a supplicant to new Roman leaders, and at other times she asserted the full dignity of a monarch who commanded resources and strategic territory. Her choices were calculated, rooted in a recognition that Egypt's autonomy depended on her skill in a world dominated by Rome. The emotional residue of her relationship with Caesar lingered. In private recollection, in the stories of courtiers, and in the public memory that he had shaped, their alliance remained a defining chapter in both their biographies. Cleopatra would carry the imprint of his influence, and Rome would carry the disturbance his death had caused to its political fabric. Memory, like power, refused to remain contained. Examining their union closely reveals how entwined questions of sexual politics and sovereignty were in antiquity. Cleopatra used her femininity as a political instrument, but she also invoked the legitimacy of ancient kingship to assert hers. Caesar, on the other hand, could not afford to be seen as weak. He needed the backing of Roman traditions even as he expanded his own authority. Each navigated a set of expectations that tied gender to governance and personal intimacy to imperial designs. The story of their relationship also shows how culture can be a tool of rule. Cleopatra patronized philosophers, poets, and religious institutions, deploying Alexandria's intellectual heft to signal her legitimacy. She understood that culture made alliances more durable by shaping the narratives people told about power. Caesar, likewise, used the stage of Roman ritual and the spectacle of military triumph to reframe his image from general to arbiter of a new order. Power, as they both practiced it, required constant legitimacy. Cleopatra's coinage, statues, and temple dedications were not only markers of wealth but also instruments meant to reassure populations that her rule was proper and enduring. Caesar's reforms and public benefactions served to anchor his authority in the civic life of Rome. Both of them recognized that the loyalties of people are secured as much by repeated rituals and visible signs as by force. Their alliance also highlights the interplay of personal reputations and institutional forces. Caesar's name carried enormous weight in Rome, but that name could be used by others to legitimate their own claims. Cleopatra's reputation, meanwhile, could be used by Romans to define enemies and by Egyptians to consolidate support. Reputation functioned as both shield and sword, and both leaders wielded it with care and occasional ruthlessness. Across the Mediterranean, merchants, soldiers, priests, and local elites watched and reacted to the changes their union brought. For traders, the alignment of Rome and Egypt meant shifting markets and new opportunities, while soldiers could expect altered postings and new allegiances. Priests in Alexandria watched warily as foreign politics reached into temple precincts, and local nobles measured the impact of Roman influence on their traditional privileges. The image of Cleopatra has been reshaped through the centuries by playwrights and novelists who simplified her into archetypes of seductress or sovereign, by historians who argued over motives, and by artists who imagined her in various guises. Yet the fuller truth resists easy categories. She was a ruler who understood how to use intimacy for statecraft, a woman who wielded symbols with strategic decisiveness, and a monarch whose personal relationships had outsized political consequences. Her story with Caesar, therefore, is a lens through which to understand the complex alchemy of love and power. There is an intimacy to power that people often neglect. It is shaped by private trusts, whispered strategies, and the small rituals that make political bonds durable. The relationship between Cleopatra and Caesar was built on those small things as much as on public ceremonies. Shared confidences, gifts exchanged in private, and late-night strategizing shaped outcomes just as much as parades and official proclamations did. Love, in their case, was not only an affair of the heart but also an instrument for creating alliances. When leaders intertwine affection with policy, their personal ties can accelerate decisions and create a fever of mutual dependency. That mutual dependency produces both strength and vulnerability. It can create a center of gravity around which regimes consolidate, but it also becomes a focal point for opponents who seek to destroy that nexus. The power of symbols in their relationship cannot be overstated. Coins bearing images, statues placed in temples, and the public presentation of children were all moves on a political chessboard. Each symbol conveyed something about legitimacy, continuity, and divine favor, and both Cleopatra and Caesar understood how to manipulate these signs to their advantage. In a world where literacy was limited and images spoke loudly, these visual messages had the force of legislation. Their alliance also reveals the ways in which empires negotiate with their neighbors. Rome did not simply conquer and obliterate, it formed marriages, client kingships, and strategic partnerships, often absorbing the cultures it encountered. Cleopatra's Egypt became part of this pattern. It was a wealthy and ancient civilization that negotiated a space of autonomy through alliances with emerging Roman power. Her skill was in preserving that autonomy as long as circumstances permitted. The emotional texture of their relationship surfaces in stories of their private interactions, moments of tenderness, of mutual amusement, and of mutual irritation. Those human moments are crucial because they remind us that history is made by people who feel and reason in equal measure. They planned campaigns and shared meals. They navigated insults and reconciled differences. In these exchanges, the contours of policy were hammered out as often as in formal councils. Power's demands shaped their days in practical ways: schedule, security, counsel, and constant calculation. They managed spies, cultivated supporters, and studied the intricacies of foreign courts. Even love had an agenda. Every gesture could be read as a strategy, and every embrace could be interpreted as a treaty. Such is the paradox of ruling up close with another sovereign. Intimacy expands the toolkit of power and complicates its exercise. The legacy of their relationship persisted well beyond their lifetimes because it affected institutions and perceptions. Rome's political trajectory changed in ways that made monarchical ideas more immediate, and Egypt's independent rule entered a long decline that would ultimately end in Roman provincial status. Their bond helped to set these trajectories in motion. It altered the tempo of events and colored the memories that later generations would inherit. As historians examine their story, they debate motives and outcomes, parsing letters, coins, and monuments for clues. But the most compelling aspect remains how two individuals used their intimacy to shape larger realities. Their union was at once intensely personal and indelibly political, a reminder that private decisions can have public consequences that echo for centuries. Cleopatra's later life, though outside the direct frame of Caesar's presence, carried traces of what they had shared. She continued to rule with the same combination of ritual and pragmatism, but the political map she navigated had been altered by his death. Her later alliances and confrontations with Rome would be influenced by the memory of what their partnership had achieved and what it had cost. Caesar's own posthumous reputation was likewise entangled with memories of his Egyptian alliance. Romans remembered him as both reformer and would-be king, and Cleopatra's figure formed a persistent motif in those recollections. He had reshaped institutions and had formed alliances that provoked fear as much as admiration, leaving a legacy that would continue to influence Roman politics for decades to come. Their love, when recalled, has been romanticized and moralized, flattened into tropes that fail to capture its full complexity. The truth is messier and more human, two ambitious people who loved and used love in equal measure, who sought security and fame, who could be tender and ruthless in nearly the same breath. They were products of their time, but they also made time bend to their wills in ways that left durable marks on history. Understanding their partnership gives us a clearer sense of how power operates in human societies. It is seldom a series of cold calculations alone. It is reinforced by emotion, ritual, and narrative. Leaders become more persuasive when they can command both the machinery of state and the language of feeling, and Cleopatra and Caesar exemplified this dual register of authority. The physical settings in which they acted mattered deeply as well. Alexandria's harbors, Rome's forums, the temples and palaces where they moved, all shaped the conduct of power. These spaces carried their own histories and meanings, and by acting within them, the two leaders tapped into layers of symbolism that magnified their actions. Geography and architecture thus became partners in the exercise of influence. Their lives were full of paradoxes that exposed the fragility of human plans. Caesar, who sought permanence through reform and monuments, was felled by a conspiracy born of fear that his power would eclipse the Republic. Cleopatra, who worked tirelessly to preserve her dynasty, found herself navigating the aftermath of his demise with shrewd improvisation. Their ambitions collided with contingency, and that collision is a lesson in the limits of foresight. Even in the realm of personal affection, contradictions flourished. There were public displays that looked like politics and private moments that carried political weight. Their emotions were entangled with ambition, and that entanglement made the stakes immeasurably higher. Love could not be separated from duty because in their world duty itself had intimate dimensions. The reverberations of their alliance reached into culture as well. Writers, orators, and artists in both the East and West found in their story a source of metaphor about power's allure and peril. Their relationship became a theme in moral lessons, a cautionary tale about entangling personal and public life, and an exemplar of political romance. The imagery created around them shaped subsequent generations' imaginations about what rulers might do when they let themselves be led by feeling as well as reason. Historically, their partnership teaches us about the limits and possibilities of cross-cultural alliances. It shows how two distinct political traditions, Hellenistic kingship and Roman republicanism, could intersect in ways that produced both cooperation and conflict. Cleopatra and Caesar negotiated differences of ritual, law, and ideology, And in doing so, they created a model for how empires might engage with old civilizations without fully absorbing or destroying them. In the end, the story refuses a neat moral. It is not simply a parable about virtue or vice, it is a chronicle of human complexity. Cleopatra and Caesar were architects of a temporary union that revealed both the powers of strategic love and the vulnerabilities of political intimacy. Their lives remind us that the theater of human affairs is populated by persons who are capable of great calculation and great tenderness at the same time. Even now, when we read about them or walk through cities that remember their names, we encounter the traces of their intertwined ambitions. Museums hold artifacts that once passed between them, coins still bear dates and faces meant to proclaim continuity, texts preserve fragments of the debates and dramas they inspired. These remnants encourage us to imagine the living world they inhabited, a world where love and power were braided together in ways that shaped empires. The story of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar is therefore more than an anecdote in a dusty chronicle. It is a study of how personal bonds can be engines of statecraft. It challenges us to think about the ethical and political limits of intimacy in public life, and to ask how much of leadership is truly personal. They teach us that power is human, and humanity can be wielded as deftly as any law or legion. As a final reflection, one might note that their union compelled contemporaries to confront uncomfortable questions about identity, loyalty, and ambition. Romans had to decide where their loyalty lay, and Egyptians had to contemplate the meaning of sovereignty in an age of Roman ascendancy. The answers were partial and contested, and the debates those answers generated continued long after both of them had left the earthly stage. To listen to their story is to hear the cadence of history shaped by individuals whose loves were political acts and whose politics were human gestures. It is to feel the tension between desire and design, between the private hearth and the public square. In that tension, Cleopatra and Caesar remain figures whose lives illuminate how hearts and thrones can become one and how the consequences of that fusion can ripple across time. The Nile unrolls like a ribbon of memory through the heart of Egypt, carrying with it sediments of time and the slow, patient power of a land that remembers empires. In that ancient, sun-blanched world, Cleopatra was born into a dynasty that came from the Mediterranean rather than from the desert sands. She inherited a kingdom whose identity was braided with Greek learning and Egyptian ritual, a house that wore two faces and spoke two tongues. To understand the queen, one must first feel the cadence of that braided world, where gods and scholars, priests and merchants, all measured their days by the river and the turning of seasons. Cleopatra's lineage was Ptolemaic, the product of Alexander's generals and the subsequent Hellenistic courts that stretched from the Aegean to the banks of the Nile. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as Hellenic monarchs who adopted pharaonic forms for legitimacy, and their court glittered with Greek culture while being deeply enmeshed in Egyptian religious life. Cleopatra herself would stand astride those cultures like a bridge, fluent in tongues and customs that allowed her to move between audiences with a sovereign's ease. She was more than a figurehead, she was a political animal taught to read the weather of power and to act upon it with precision. Across the Mediterranean, Rome was no longer merely a city-state, it was a magnet for ambition and a crucible of men who sought both glory and the fat spoils of war. Into this rising world strode Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony, a man forged in the flame of Roman politics and battlefield experience. He was larger than the office he held, charismatic, volatile, and unafraid of dramatic gestures that proclaimed authority. Antony's life had been shaped by civil wars and shifting allegiances, and his name already carried the weight of triumphs that were both military and political. Their meeting, when it came, was not merely a meeting of lovers but a collision of two worlds and two ambitions. Cleopatra, with the practiced gestures of a born ruler and the cultivated mystique of a Hellenistic queen, engaged Antony with theater and policy intertwined. Antony, for his part, found in Cleopatra not only a seductress of the senses but a partner in governance, a sovereign capable of matching and amplifying his ambitions in the East. Their alliance would become a drama that Rome itself would watch with equal parts fascination and dread. Cleopatra's life before Antony read like a study in the durable art of survival. She was schooled in the exigencies of dynastic politics, where siblings became rivals and the throne was a currency to be defended. Egypt had brought her a deep sense of what it meant to rule, ceremonies to maintain, grain stores to protect, a populace that needed bread and gods who needed their cults tended. She had learned early how to translate authority into spectacle, how to take rituals meant for gods and perform them in ways that held people and power at once. Antony's early years were a lesson in the Roman hunger for fame and place. He was the son of a line with political hopes and the protege of Julius Caesar, a man who had shaped the late Republic's fate. Under Caesar's patronage, Antony rose, commanding men and ships, feeling again and again the intoxicating closeness of victory. Yet victory in Rome always came with strings, alliances had to be balanced, enemies placated, and the whims of public opinion navigated as ruthlessly as any battlefield maneuver. When Julius Caesar fell in the Ides of March, the political map of the Mediterranean began to rearrange itself like cards scattered across a table. Cleopatra had already had a relationship with Caesar, one that consolidated her claim and brought Egypt temporary stability. Caesar's presence in Alexandria after his intervention in Ptolemaic quarrels was a hinge moment in Cleopatra's career, demonstrating how Roman favor could become an instrument of dynastic survival. His assassination left a vacuum of authority and the world roiled in civil conflict, giving rise to the fractious Second Triumvirate and a new scramble for influence. Antony, who had been Caesar's right hand in many matters, emerged as a leading figure among those who would carry Rome forward or break it apart. He, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Triumvirate, a triangular power whose seams were always under stress. Antony turned his gaze eastward, to lands rife with riches and legions, to a chance for autonomy from Rome's increasingly centralizing energies. In the east he found not only territory but a realm where the old Hellenistic forms still mattered, where kings and queens could be partners rather than merely subordinates to Roman governors. Cleopatra sought to recover and secure the integrity of her kingdom after Caesar's death, and Antony was a key to that goal. Their first significant encounter was shaped by diplomacy and spectacle, when Cleopatra met Antony in Tarsus, an urban crossroads of trade and power. Stories of her entrance into the Romans' presence, wrapped, according to some accounts, in a carpet or a roll of linen, have the sheen of myth. But what matters more than the singular image is the deliberate mingling of show and substance. She came prepared to perform royalty and to negotiate, revealing a mind that was at once theatrical and shrewd. The initial chemistry between them was electric, a fusion of political calculation and personal magnetism. Antony saw in Cleopatra a ruler who understood statecraft as he did, and Cleopatra recognized in him the Roman force capable of guaranteeing Egypt's interests and extending her own. They were partners in a convergence that felt natural to both, Antony needing a sovereign ally in the east, and Cleopatra requiring a Roman counterweight to her internal foes. Their intimacy, then, was inseparable from their mutual pursuits of power and legacy. Once the alliance took root, Rome's senators and Octavian watched with suspicion. The Romans had always been wary of Eastern monarchies and their opulence, and the idea that a Roman leader would be entangled with an Eastern queen stirred anxieties about luxury and the corruption of Roman virtue. Antony, who had always admired Hellenistic culture, seemed to embrace what Roman conservatives denounced. The propaganda sword was unsheathed, and political enemies sharpened images of Antony as a man beguiled and compromised by Oriental extravagance. In Alexandria, Cleopatra entertained Antony with palaces that shimmered with mosaics, gardens that smelled of jasmine and citrus, and festivals that reenacted religious myths for a court of courtiers and soldiers. The partnership extended beyond love and lavishness. Cleopatra supplied fleets, grain, and funds. Antony needed the resources to maintain his eastern front and to compete with Octavian in Rome. The two wove a web of mutual dependency in which affection and policy were bound so tightly that one could scarcely be separated from the other. Their relationship produced not only political agreements but children, offspring who embodied the union of Roman and Egyptian ambitions. These children were living talismans of a possible synthesis between the two powers, a symbol that something new might be born from their entwined fortunes. Antony publicly acknowledged these children and elevated them, gestures that would later be used by their enemies as evidence of betrayal and of Antony's drift away from Roman priorities. In Antony's world, family and politics were inseparable, but to Rome the family became an emblem of transgression. One of the most dramatic public manifestations of their union was the donations of Alexandria, a ceremonial distribution of lands and titles to Cleopatra and her children by Antony's own hand. To Antony, it was an act of legitimate imperial policy, an attempt to restructure power across the eastern provinces and to sanction heirs who could maintain stability. To Octavian and traditionalists in Rome, however, it was a provocation, a daring overstep by a Roman general who seemed to be installing foreign kings under his authority. The ceremony provided potent material for Roman propaganda that portrayed Antony as both a traitor and a slave to Oriental seduction. As the rift with Octavian widened, Rome became a stage for increasingly vicious political theater. Octavian, skillful in the art of public manipulation, presented Antony as exemplary of everything Rome feared: luxury, effeminacy, and the surrender of Roman values. He painted Cleopatra as a foreign enchantress who had ensnared a great Roman leader and turned him into a puppet of Eastern despotism. These accusations were not merely personal attacks, but strategic maneuvers designed to consolidate support for Octavian's bid to claim leadership over Rome and its provinces. Propaganda took many forms, from speeches in the Forum to carefully staged images. Coins were struck, letters were read aloud, and performances were crafted to shape public sentiment. Antony's absence from Rome, spent with Cleopatra in the East, fed the narrative that he had abandoned his duties and the Republic's traditions. Octavian, who knew how to shape perception, used these gaps to his advantage, crafting a portrait of himself as the defender of Roman dignity against the corrupting East. Yet beneath the public vitriol lay a personal partnership that contained moments of genuine tenderness and private negotiation. Cleopatra and Antony were more than the sum of the stories told by their enemies. They shared strategic conversations about the future of the Mediterranean world and private moments that humanized them beyond the political caricatures. Cleopatra's intelligence and fluency in multiple languages allowed her to converse with Antony on matters of governance, finance, and diplomacy in ways that few other rulers could. They were, to their friends, a couple whose ambitions were matched by an intimacy that spurred both courage and recklessness. Their private lives were punctuated by the sensory richness of Hellenistic courts, banquets where music and conversation intertwined, perfumed rooms where stratagems were whispered, and audience chambers where petitions and plans were folded into the same gestures. Cleopatra's presence was simultaneously regal and intimate. She could preside over state ceremonies while also engaging Antony in confessions of fear, desire, and political calculus. To follow their story is to witness the thin membrane between policy and passion, how one often bled into the other in the crucible of empire. Alexandria itself played an essential role in their saga. The city was an urban marvel, a crucible of trade, culture, and learning, home to the legendary library and a marketplace buzzing with merchants whose goods came from the farthest reaches of the known world. It was a place where a queen could stage magnificence and where the East's riches were visible in brazen sculptures and lavish architecture. Such a scene supported Cleopatra's self-presentation as a sovereign who embodied both the Hellenic past and the Egyptian present, an image calculated to impress friends and intimidate foes. At sea, their power was visible in fleets that glinted like a moving constellation under the sun. Naval prowess mattered as much as legions in the Mediterranean, and Antony's control of fleets aided their power projection. Cleopatra's ships, known to be extravagant and built for spectacle, became floating embodiments of their partnership's prestige. On the decks of those ships, the two could stage performances that were political, personal, and theatrical, weaving a narrative that projected strength to allies and ostentation to enemies. Military campaigns in the East further entwined their fates. Antony was responsible for defending and reorganizing provinces that lay between him and the boundaries of Rome's influence. These responsibilities were heavy not only in terms of manpower but in finance, logistics, and diplomacy. Cleopatra's resources, especially grain and funding, were indispensable to sustaining these operations. Their mutual dependency deepened as campaigns required continued coordination between sovereign and general. Beneath grand strategies lay the everyday labors that make governance possible. Grain shipments needed to be assured so cities did not starve, debts had to be managed to keep mercenary bands loyal, and religious cults had to be honored to placate local sensibilities. Cleopatra's administrative skill was not merely ceremonial, she knew the protocols by which communities remained stable. Antony's skill was often martial, but he recognized that victory on the battlefield did not automatically translate into stable rule without the hand that managed the city's granaries and the rituals that bound people to their rulers. Their alliance, though strong, was never immune to the slow erosion of trust and the sudden detonations of rivalry. Antony's time in the East created distance between him and Rome, both politically and emotionally, and the distance bred suspicion. Meanwhile, Cleopatra, focused on preserving Egypt and projecting power for her children's futures, pressed Antony into public commitments that complicated his standing in Rome. Political life in that era thrived on calculation and image, and the pair found themselves increasingly vulnerable to the manipulation of those who stood to gain from their downfall. The stage for the final act was set by the convergence of naval capacity, public sentiment, and political cunning. Octavian, building momentum in Rome, declared war not only on Antony but on Cleopatra, packaging the campaign as a defense of Roman values against foreign corruption. By framing Cleopatra as the real target, Octavian tapped into a vein of xenophobia and fear of monarchical systems that ran deep in Roman political culture. Antony found himself forced into a defensive posture, his reputation and career at stake as his enemies consolidated against him. The Battle of Actium became the great climatic moment, a confrontation that would decide the future of the Mediterranean world. Ships massed in line, commanders shouted orders, The sea heaved under the weight of oars and canvas. Antony's and Cleopatra's forces met Octavian's under skies taut with expectation, and a flute of tension ran through both camps. The battle's outcome was less an inevitable triumph for one side than the product of months of attrition, logistics, and decisions made in moments of fear and hope. Actium's result was catastrophic for Antony and Cleopatra. The naval engagement turned in Octavian's favor, aided by commanders who shifted allegiance at critical moments and the dryness of resources that had drained Antony's ability to sustain the fight. Antony's forces retreated, and the retreat became a rout when desertion and despair spread through the ranks. Cleopatra, whose ships had a different role and whose priority was to preserve her dynasty, sailed away with some vessels, leaving Antony to face the collapse of his position. The narratives of cowardice and betrayal that followed have been shaped by Roman propaganda, but the raw reality was a military catastrophe that left their options few. In the aftermath of Actium, their story tightened toward an inevitable tragedy. Pursued by Octavian, the lovers retreated to Alexandria, a city that had been the stage of their greatest triumphs and would become the theater of their last moments. The arrival back into familiar precincts could not mend the fractures of fear and defeat. Roman legions bore down on the city, and the palace that once shimmered with power now stood in the shadow of conquest. The fall of Alexandria was both political conquest and cultural rupture. Octavian's forces encircled the city, and the machinery of Roman triumph began to assert itself. Cleopatra tried to negotiate, looking for terms that would preserve a degree of dignity and safety for her children. Octavian, mindful of the spectacle of victory he sought, played a measured hand, swift enough to subdue any rebellion but calculating in how he would present the vanquished to the Roman world. Antony's final moments have been narrated with cinematic intensity. Wounded, believing Cleopatra to be dead, he fell upon his sword in despair. The wound was mortal, and as he lay dying he was told that Cleopatra still lived. The detail that he was brought to her tomb before he died is a scene heavy with poetic inevitability, a last mingling of love and regret. Antony's death was as much a personal calamity as a political removal, for it removed the last serious Roman rival arranged against Octavian's hegemony. Cleopatra's end, shrouded in legend, is one of the most famous deaths of antiquity. Accounts vary: an asp's bite, a poisonous ointment, or elegant theater designed to control the manner of her passing. Whether Cleopatra chose the serpent or another method, she acted within the only agency left to a sovereign who faced humiliation and captivity. Suicide was a way to deny Octavian the triumph of parading a living queen through Roman streets, to preserve some dignity and to assert control over the final act of her life. After their deaths, Octavian transported Antony's and Cleopatra's bodies to Rome as part of his political theater, but he allowed them to be buried together in Alexandria, where they had chosen to build a final monument to their union. The tomb, long sought by archaeologists and subject to mythic speculation, became another element in the story's endless afterlife. Their burial together completed, in some sense, the narrative arc that had made them inseparable in life and in memory, lovers and rulers who had tried to bend the Mediterranean to a shared vision. The immediate consequences for the children and for Egypt were severe. Octavian incorporated Egypt into the Roman sphere as a personal province, effectively turning it into an imperial resource under his control. Cleopatra's children were brought before Rome, paraded, and then treated as political instruments. Some were kept alive, others met darker fates in the shifting calculus of Roman policy. Egypt lost its independence, and the Ptolemaic line, which had once ruled as pharaohs, ended with Cleopatra. The Hellenistic experiment of a Grecian royal court in Egypt had folded into the machinery of Roman imperialism. Yet the end of their lives did not end their story. Antony and Cleopatra's romance and fall fed art, literature, and history across centuries. Roman poets and playwrights took up their tale as a warning against luxury and the dangers of foreign influence, while later artists reimagined them as tragic lovers, star-crossed and noble. Shakespeare's rendering would immortalize their drama in a theater of emotion and rhetoric, but before and after him the story served many masters. Moralists, romantics, nationalists, and imperials used the narrative to press their own arguments. Cultural memory transformed their precise historical contours into symbols. Cleopatra became a cipher whose image shifted according to the needs of those who invoked her, sometimes a femme fatale, sometimes a wise and cultured queen, sometimes a proto-feminist reading of a woman exercising agency in a man's world. Antony could be cast as a heroic general ruined by love, an ineffectual seduced Roman, or a tragic figure undone by historical forces larger than himself. These reframings reveal as much about later centuries' obsessions as they do about the two sovereigns themselves. Modern scholarship has tried to pry apart the layers of propaganda and myth to reach a more complex truth. Historians and archaeologists have scrutinized coins, inscriptions, and the fragmentary records to sketch a Cleopatra who was multilingual, politically astute, and deeply engaged in the management of her realm. Antony emerges as a man of contradictions, a competent military commander who could also surrender to impulsive choices. The interplay between archival evidence and received legend shows us how fragile and mutable historical memory can be. The material remains of their epic, the ruins and artifacts of Alexandria and other Hellenistic cities, give us glimpses that both confirm and confound the stories. Mosaics, papyri, and pottery whisper of a world of cross-cultural exchange, where Greek science and Egyptian tradition coexisted alongside Roman pragmatism. The cosmopolitanism of Alexandria allowed for an exchange of ideas and goods that made it possible for a queen like Cleopatra to be a patron of learning and a shrewd manager of a state's economy. The archaeological record, even when fragmentary, supports the idea that their age was one of vibrant, if precarious, globalization. Cleopatra's image in particular underwent metamorphoses across time. Roman sources, often hostile, emphasized her foreignness and used salacious details to delegitimize her rule. Later Christian and medieval writers added layers of moral judgment that obscured the political realities of her life. In the Renaissance and beyond, artists reinvented her in new guises, regal, sensual, tragic, each version a reflection of contemporary tastes more than historical accuracy. As historians peeled back those layers, a different picture emerged, one of a ruler whose intellect and political savvy had been central to her long tenure. Antony's reputation has similarly been the subject of reevaluation. Once dismissed by Roman moralists as a man corrupted by extravagance, he has been reconsidered by those who see in him a leader caught between the institutional inertia of Rome and the centrifugal pulls of personal loyalty and ambition. His choices, seen through the lens of ancient Roman politics, can be understood as both strategic and profoundly risky. Modern scholarship tends to view Antony as a man whose grand gestures sometimes clouded underlying practicality, yet who retained a capacity for governance that Rome ultimately could not absorb easily. The romance itself functions as a narrative mechanism that both simplifies and complicates our understanding. To the storytellers, their love explains grand political movements. To political analysts, their bond provided a vehicle for ambitious power shifts. The truth likely sits in between, a mixture of personal attachment and cold calculation that turned into a partnership with monumental consequences. Love, after all, in human affairs often intersects with ambition, and their lives are a testament to the hybrid nature of such unions. Beyond politics and drama, there is a persistent fascination with Cleopatra's persona as an emblem of female rulership. Rulers who happen to be women are often read through a different lens, their gestures sexualized or moralized in ways seldom applied to men. Cleopatra's intelligence and command were refracted through this gendered scrutiny, and later interpreters oscillated between vilifying and glorifying her. And that tension is a conversation about power's gendered perception and the way societies narrate female authority. Their story also provides a study in how image-making works in the ancient world. Coins with rulers' faces were not mere currency, they were instruments of propaganda, portable images that communicated legitimacy. Public ceremonies, dedications to gods, and state-sponsored festivals were all means of shaping a populace's sense of order and right. Cleopatra and Antony used these tools, and their enemies used them in reverse to shape public opinion in Rome. The ancient media ecology, though different in form, was not unlike our modern world of messaging and spin. To listen carefully to their tale is to watch power in motion, the way resources funnel to support ambition, how rituals can be repurposed as political theater, and how personal alliances can redirect empires. Both Cleopatra and Antony were products of their time, steeped in the politics of patronage, honor, and dynastic necessity. They navigated networks of loyalties, from mercenaries to priests to Roman senators, and each decision was measured against the fragile arithmetic of loyalty and revenue. Understanding their choices demands an appreciation for the multiplicity of pressures that governed ancient statecraft. Their legacy, then, is a mirror that reflects changing values across centuries. In some ages, they were a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing romance and governance. In others, they were tragic figures who defied the relentless machinery of Roman centralization. In every retelling, the essential human questions remain: how should power be exercised? Who is fit to rule? And what are the costs when empires clash with personal loyalties? Their answers change with the times, but the questions themselves continue to resonate. There is also a sense in which the geography of their lives shaped their possibilities. The Mediterranean was not a backdrop but an active player, the sea that enabled trade, troop movements, and cultural interchange. Cities like Alexandria, Tarsus, and Rome were more than settings. They were actors in a drama that produced alliances and ruptures. Control of ports, grain shipments, and naval supremacy were daily constraints and enablers for rulers. Thus, the physical logistics of empire were inseparable from the narrative of Cleopatra and Antony. Time and again, the story highlights the hazards of charisma without consolidation. Antony was charismatic, a man whose personality could fill chambers and armies, but charisma without institutions to sustain it can prove fragile. Cleopatra's cunning produced stability in Egypt for decades, yet even she could not withstand the tide of Roman consolidation under a skillful propagandist like Octavian. What their partnership achieved was remarkable in the short term, and yet vulnerable in the long term to a political system that increasingly favored centralized, militarized domination. Examining their personal traits offers further texture. Cleopatra was reportedly clever, well-educated, and musically talented, someone who appreciated philosophy and mathematics as much as ritual. Antony, by contrast, seemed to thrive on action and presence, preferring the immediacy of command. Their differences were complementary. Cleopatra's inclination to design and manage matched Antony's appetite for conquest and public theater. Together they formed a composite leadership that was innovative but also, paradoxically, more subject to critique because it did not conform to Roman senatorial norms. The romance's theatricality is not mere embellishment, it served a function. Public display, in the ancient world, was a form of governance, a way to teach subjects who their rulers were and how they intended to be obeyed. By staging splendors, banquets and processions, dedications to gods, Cleopatra and Antony communicated that their rule would be both legitimate and magnificent. Spectacle, then, was policy, and it could both awe and alarm. In Rome's political imagination, such spectacle when associated with Eastern courts became shorthand for decadence and moral decline. Another dimension of their story is the interplay of religion and sovereignty. Cleopatra often presented herself in the guise of Isis, aligning her image with Egyptian religious frameworks that confirmed her as a living goddess. Antony's recognition of those cultic links helped solidify his authority in the East, where local traditions mattered as much as military might. The manipulation of religious symbolism was central to their strategy, allowing them to claim divine favor while also appealing to the local population's sense of continuity and cultural identity. We should also note the surprisingly modern feel of their political maneuvering. They negotiated alliances, borrowed money, financed fleets, and sought to craft narratives about themselves that would travel across the Mediterranean like a brand. Antony's attempts to legitimize his children through public ceremonies and Cleopatra's efforts to secure her dynasty's future echo contemporary concerns about succession and public perception. In that sense, their story is not only ancient history but a template for understanding how power is engineered and maintained. As time wore on, the stories of their misdeeds and virtues became moral fodder for generations. Poets lamented the tragedy, moralists used it as caution, and artists painted scenes of grandeur and despair. Each era rewove their tale into a fabric that reflected its anxieties: imperial fear, tensions over gender and rule, the anxiety of cultural mixing. The continuing fascination with Cleopatra and Antony thus reveals a strand of continuity in human thought about leadership, desire, and the cost of ambition. If one listens closely to the whispers of antiquity, one hears a chorus of voices: the court chroniclers who admired their splendor, the Roman senators who denounced their excesses, the Alexandrian merchants who counted grain and debt, and the soldiers who marched under their banners. Each voice offers a facet of the truth, and together they compose a mosaic that is both incomplete and arrestingly vivid. To reconstruct their lives is to accept ambiguity and to weigh evidence with a recognition that history is always partial. The academic debates continue to churn, and each new discovery offers a fresh fragment. Papyri that recount administrative details, coins that bear their likenesses, and inscriptions that illuminate civic honors all feed into a slowly growing picture. Archaeologists search for the tomb and for residues of the palaces that once presided over Alexandria's harbors. Even as facts accumulate, myth refuses to vanish, instead it adapts, mingling with scholarship to produce rich and often contradictory portraits. In many ways, Cleopatra and Antony are a lens through which we can examine the ancient Mediterranean's complexity. Their lives illustrate how empires collide and contain one another, how individuals navigate the levers of power, and how personal relationships can recalibrate geopolitics. They embodied the crossroads of Greek intellect, Egyptian religion, and Roman ambition, and their choices accelerated the transition from a world of competing Hellenistic kingdoms to one dominated by a single Roman ruler. Listening to their story now, One perceives the human currents beneath the armor of history: fear, aspiration, vanity, tenderness, strategy, and regret. These are not abstractions, but the forces that pushed them to sail into the storm at Actium, to celebrate kingship with pageantry, and to make choices in rooms scented with myrrh and political consequence. The ancient past becomes vivid because the human heart remains, and its motives and failures recognizably ours. Their romance is thus both ancient and timeless. It is a tale about what can happen when love and ambition meet under the glaring light of history, when two people try to shape, together, the map of their world. It speaks of courage and miscalculation, of agency and fate, and of the ways political systems enforce their own narratives upon those who would resist them. When we remember Cleopatra and Antony, we remember not only a pair of lovers but a moment when the Mediterranean held a possibility of synthesis that ended in cataclysm. And yet, even in loss, they achieved a form of immortality. Their names passed through the mouths of poets and into the brushes of painters. They became subjects of plays and operas, their images remade for the stage and screen. Each retelling added layers, some of which enlarged their humanity and others that hardened them into archetypes. The persistence of their story testifies to the enduring human urge to retell dramatic lives and to search for meaning in the mingled ash of glory and defeat. We continue to be fascinated because their lives force us to ask difficult questions about power's nature. What price should be paid for rule? How do personal desires intersect with public duties? Can a ruler be both beloved and effective when the public sphere demands certain forms of virtue? Cleopatra and Antony lived answers to these questions with an intensity that still jolts us centuries later when we consider their consequences. In the hush after their deaths, the Mediterranean resumed its restless motion, reshaped by Roman hegemony but still echoing with the artifacts of Hellenistic culture. Alexandria would remain a center of learning and commerce for centuries, its lights dimming and brightening under successive regimes. For a time, the age of independent Hellenistic monarchies ended, but the cultural crosscurrents they had fostered continued to ripple through the ancient world. The imprint of Cleopatra's court, the structural changes instituted by the Romans, and the stories that followed all became ingredients in a long historical stew that would flavor later civilizations. If you stand today on the shores of Egypt, you might imagine the flutter of sails and the glitter of palace windows along a harbor that once saw their comings and goings. The breeze that lifts dust from dunes might carry echoes of sailors calling out, of priests chanting in temples, of a queen conferring with a Roman general about the grain that would feed cities. Those sensory imaginings bridge centuries and make the past less distant, reminding us that history is not only a sequence of events but a set of lived experiences that once felt immediate to the people who lived them. The human interest in Cleopatra and Antony also teaches us about narrative's power to shape moral outlooks. Stories can be used to instruct, to warn, to glorify, and to shame. Octavian used story to build an empire, artists used story to explore human passion, historians use story to probe cause and effect. Each use of the tale reframes it slightly, and in that reframing we glimpse our own concerns as much as theirs. Their lives are a mirror held up to us across millennia, reflecting our fears and our fascinations. In the last accounting, Cleopatra and Antony's union was an attempt to create a new political geometry in a world where old maps were tearing at the seams. They tried to bind together peoples and polities with the thread of personal union and shared ambition. The attempt failed in the face of determined opposition, logistical fragilities, and political cunning. Yet failure does not extinguish significance, and their attempt reshaped the contours of history in ways that still invite reflection. Ultimately, their tale is a study in the fragility of human enterprises when they confront the hard realities of geopolitics. Passion can lead to greatness, but passion without durable institutional grounding is vulnerable. They remind us that charismatic leadership needs structures that can survive personal catastrophe, and that empires are often swept by tides that no single leader, however brilliant or beloved, can entirely control. Antony and Cleopatra's lives are, thus, a parable and a chronicle, a story of ambition's reach and the limits imposed by age, geography, and the shifting desires of men and gods. As you carry this story through your day, whether hearing it while traffic hums or while the kettle sings, remember that Cleopatra and Antony lived in a world both foreign and familiar. Their drama was one of sumptuous intimacy and vast consequence, of public spectacle and private tenderness, of strategic alliance and catastrophic defeat. Their names endure because they speak to the complexity of power and the perennial human desire to make history cohere to personal vision. In their rise and fall, we find both a caution and a kind of dark, irresistible beauty. Cleopatra entered history as a storm, not a mere woman on a throne, and from the start her life threaded through war and cunning like the Nile through Egypt's fields. She claimed a lineage that reached back to Macedonian kings, and she ruled a realm that balanced Greek culture and ancient Egyptian religiosity. Her world was saturated with diplomacy and danger, with neighboring powers watching every decision and Roman ambition growing like a shadow on the Mediterranean. To understand her, one had to watch how she maneuvered those forces, bending alliances and enemies into tools for survival and ambition. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Cleopatra seized the instant with a rare mix of theatricality and calculation. She smuggled herself into the royal palace rolled in a carpet, or so the story goes, and met the Roman leader with a confidence that read as both charm and strategy. That meeting changed Rome's opinion of Egypt and marked the first time Cleopatra engaged directly with the might that would shape the Mediterranean's future. Their alliance and the child that followed bound Egypt to Rome in ways that complicated loyalties and raised stakes across the region. After Caesar's assassination, the city of Rome convulsed with competing claims and unresolved loyalties, and Egypt watched every shift with anxious eyes. Cleopatra aligned with Mark Antony, one of Rome's most charismatic and violent commanders, and their relationship grew into both a political partnership and a passionate affair. Their connection was not merely romantic spectacle, it was a pact against those who threatened their shared interests, with Alexandria becoming a center of power that rivaled Rome in wealth and splendor. Their combined court was a theater of politics, where banquet and battle plans were woven together by whispered promises and calculated gestures. Antony's ambitions reached eastward, and he sought to build an empire that would stretch into the Parthian world. Cleopatra supported his campaigns with ships, finance, and supplies, drawing on Egypt's grain and gold to fund legions and navies. In return, Antony established client kings and reorganized provinces in ways that favored his authority and Cleopatra's influence. Each move tightened the knot between them, and at the same time made them enemies in Rome, where men like Octavian saw threat in their union and opportunity in their weakness. Octavian understood images and language. He wielded Roman virtue like a blade in the public mind. He painted Antony as a Roman seduced by an Eastern queen, a general who had traded Rome's honor for exotic pleasures. Whether every accusation held truth mattered less than the story Octavian could sell to senators and citizens. Propaganda, in that age as in ours, shaped loyalties, and Octavian's narrative aimed to make Antony and Cleopatra appear traitors to Rome rather than rightful rulers seeking security and dominance. As rhetoric sharpened into confrontation, military preparations followed, and the scene set for Actium took shape along sea and shore. Antony had assembled a mixed force, larger by some counts in ships and soldiers, while Octavian relied on the keen seamanship and engineering of Marcus Agrippa. Agrippa's talent lay in logistics, in harbors, and harrying an opponent until their strengths turned to weaknesses. The stage for Actium was not just the open sea, it was a contest of ports, supply lines, and the ability to control movement in a world where a single storm or a missed message could change everything. Cleopatra's fleet was a statement of intent itself, gleaming and vast, lined with pentacounters and larger vessels that bore both soldiers and the pride of Egypt. Her ships were not merely instruments of war, but symbols of a dynasty's dignity and a queen's personal stake in the outcome. She directed supplies and precious cargoes on those decks, and her presence was meant to bolster Antony's standing among Marines who would look to her as much as to Roman command. To sail into battle beside Antony was to make a gamble on both love and power. Antony's command style blended Roman discipline with theatrical flamboyance. He understood formations and could order troops with the cool of a practiced general, yet his vanity sometimes slowed decisive moves. The combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra had to coordinate armies and navies of different traditions, and that fusion demanded a level of command unity they sometimes failed to achieve. Differences in training, language, and tactical doctrine could be exploited by a foe who sought to press the seams of their cooperation. Agrippa served Octavian with a ruthlessness and craft bred in engineering and seamanship, and he turned harbors into traps and every coastline into a chessboard. He cut off supplies, seized islands that controlled approaches, and displayed a mastery of blockade that would starve Antony's options. Agrippa's smaller, more maneuverable ships slipped through channels and harried larger vessels, forcing Antony to adopt a defensive posture that undermined confidence among his crews. When sea power ruled the day, these practicalities decided fates more often than speeches or salutes. The geography around Actium gave the battle its distinct character, a bay shaped like a thumb guarding the western entrance to the Ionian Sea. The currents and narrow pass funneled movement, and local knowledge of tides and shoals could grant a fleet an advantage. Antony and Cleopatra anchored their fleet with an eye to protecting their transports and their reach back to Alexandria, but that posture also limited mobility and exposed them to Agrippa's tactical piercing. In coastal warfare, water was not just terrain, it was an active participant in strategy, carrying rumor, fire, and fortune across waves. In the weeks before the battle, spies and diplomats whispered along necks and through corridors, and both camps tried to bend neutral powers to their aims. Greek city-states, Hellenistic princes, and even pirates played roles that could tip supply lines or offer a refuge for a fleeing ship. Cleopatra's network in the eastern Mediterranean was formidable. Merchants, envoys, and captains understood she could reward loyalty and punish defection. The romance of her court masked a sophisticated intelligence apparatus that fed on gifts, favors, and the fear of Egypt's anger. Octavian farmed Rome's discontent with Antony carefully, sending men and messages to cities and commanders to remind them of Roman traditions Antony seemed to neglect. He appealed to senators who feared Antony's eastern honors and sought to portray himself as restorer of Rome's old order. The Senate, after long years of civil war, wanted stability, and Octavian promised it with the rhetoric of peace and the image of restoration. Many Romans, weary of endless fighting, preferred the orderly march of law to the unpredictable leaps of a powerful triumvirate. When the moment came and the fleets met, the clash was both tactical and theatrical, with each commander trying to make the other answer on terms they preferred. Antony's ships were built for boarding and close combat, a style that favored larger crafts and veteran marines. Octavian's squadron, guided by Agrippa, favored maneuver, missiles, and disruption, using lighter ships to harass the enemy and to separate their formations. Naval battle in antiquity was a noisy, chaotic affair, with rams cracking hulls and grappling hooks bringing combatants into savage proximity. The day of Actium offered wind and tide that favored movement along the open sea, and Agrippa exploited that advantage to harry Antony's flanks. He sent squadrons to the northern shores and seized islands that broke Antony's lines, and in doing so he choked Antony's ability to support his transports and supply ships. The larger fleet could not close without risking being picked apart by lighter craft supported by a disciplined missile arm. Antony found himself forced to choose between saving his cumbersome transports or risking decisive battle, and the paradox haunted his command choices. Cleopatra watched from her flagship with an intensity that mixed hope and dread, understanding the material consequences of a single decision made in a moment of confusion. She had invested wealth and reputation, and her fate had become entangled with Antony's in ways that were hard to disentangle without mutual ruin. Reports later claimed the Queen's ships turned and fled during the engagement, a movement that would be interpreted in different ways by different witnesses. To some it was cowardice, to others it was a tactical withdrawal intended to preserve a lifeline for retreat and the safety of treasure and heirs. Historians still debate the exact sequence of events, but what mattered in the immediate aftermath was perception and morale, and these unraveled for Antony in the cruelest fashion. Seeing Cleopatra's vessels moving away could have been read as desertion by Roman marines who expected unwavering support. Antony, in a moment torn between duty and passion, abandoned tactical coherence and left his ships to pursue what he feared he had already lost. The result was a collapse of order that Octavian's men exploited with ruthless efficiency. Ancient warfare was not clean. It violated ideals and stained reputations with rumor and resentment, and Actium produced both. Survivors told tales that simplified complex choices into moral fables, one party brave, the other perfidious. Octavian's propagandists gleefully embellished any action that could frame Antony as weak and Cleopatra as treacherous. The victors wrote the first drafts of history, and they knew how to stitch narratives that served the new regime's needs. Even as battle ended, the political consequences unfolded like ripples across the Mediterranean. Octavian tightened control over provinces and installed men who would be loyal to his person rather than to Rome's old oligarchy. Antony's loyalists scattered, some rallying in remote towns, others switching sides to survive. Cleopatra retreated with what remained of her treasury and her court to Alexandria, where a siege and a diplomatic tightening would soon test the last threads of her power. Alexandria itself became a theater of defense and diplomacy, and the city's famed harbor and fortifications gave Cleopatra hope of resisting Rome's tightening embrace. She fortified positions, stored grain, and prepared for a siege that would test both material and morale. But Octavian proved patient, blockading ports and negotiating with local elites to turn them away from her cause. The queen's servants worked day and night to maintain the illusion of abundance even as ships and coins diminished. Money and supply lines often decided ancient wars more surely than swords, and Cleopatra's coffers, once plentiful, began to strain under the demands of prolonged conflict. She had spent fortunes on fleets and favor, and while Egypt's grain was a strategic asset, moving it under blockade became costly and risky. Alexandria relied on maritime trade, and as ports fell or were denied, panic and hardship touched even the wealthier quarters. Scarcity reshaped loyalties, and those who could see a path to safety began bargaining for peace rather than glory. The siege of Alexandria was not merely a military contest, it was also a struggle of wills and messages, and both sides sent envoys to test where compromise might lie. Cleopatra tried to negotiate, at times offering surrender terms that preserved her dynasty if she could secure safe passage. Octavian, hungry for complete victory and wary of leaving a viable rival in her place, demanded submission that would end Ptolemaic independence. Those negotiations moved slowly against a backdrop of maneuver, espionage, and occasional displays meant to unsettle the other side. Cleopatra's image mattered as much in her final days as her men and ships had in the earlier campaign. She staged rituals and appearances that reminded Egyptians of her divine associations, presenting herself in temples as Isis reborn and commanding reverence from priests and populace alike. That symbolism aimed to transform political resistance into religious loyalty and to make any Roman interference seem sacrilege. It was an effort to defend sovereignty by invoking memory and faith, a last recourse when armies seemed insufficient. The human cost of these decisions was enormous and intimate, and Alexandria's streets echoed with grief and fear as families faced uncertain futures. Soldiers who returned bore scars, both physical and mental, from chaotic sea fights and brutal skirmishes. Merchants who lost ships and goods counted debts they could not cover, while servants and artisans fretted about whether their bread would continue to go untaken. War stripped away layers of comfort and security and forced people into choices they had never imagined making. Yet Cleopatra remained resolute, blending sorrow with a fierce refusal to bow without a plan for dignity. She gathered loyal companions and rehearsed for the moment when the world would demand a public stance she could not avoid. Stories later told of her garments, of poisons, and of a final act framed in myth-like detail, but in the months leading to what would be called an ending, she negotiated, shelled, and schemed with the pragmatic mind of a ruler who had faced mortal danger before. Each plan she considered was measured against how it would preserve her family's name and the memory of Egypt's sovereignty. Octavian advanced ever closer to Alexandria with an army that seemed to embody Roman efficiency, but even so his men met resistance in narrow streets and walled quarters. Urban warfare favored those who knew their alleys and held staircases, and Alexandria's defenders used those advantages well. Siege engines and naval blockades worked on different scales, and while Octavian could starve a city, he could not simply force its heart to stop beating without paying for every street he took. Both sides learned the cost of victory in lives and expenditure. In the final days, news of Antony's death reached Cleopatra and changed the calculus of what remained possible. The general's suicide, whether prompted by miscommunication, despair, or a refusal to fall into enemy hands, closed a chapter that had been jointly woven for years. For Cleopatra, it was both a personal blow and a political disaster. The alliance that had given her the clearest path forward now lay broken and impossible to resurrect. She faced a difficult question: how to end her life with a dignity that could still claim sovereignty of spirit. Ancient accounts differ on the details, and that ambiguity itself reveals how history is often a palimpsest of narratives layered by time and interest. Some tales spoke of a poisoned asp, others of cosmetics laced with venom, and some historians suspected more prosaic means. What was clear in every version was the desire to make Cleopatra's final act resonate as a deliberate and sovereign choice, a refusal to be paraded as a captive in Rome's triumph. In death, she sought a narrative she could own, just as in life she had crafted her public image with care. The spectacle of a Roman triumph loomed large in the minds of Egypt's people. Roman custom displayed defeated kings in chains, a sight to confirm the empire's supremacy. Cleopatra, knowing that her body could become a prop in Rome's pageant, chose to deny the conqueror that grim theater. By orchestrating her own end, she aimed to assert control in the only domain left to her, the telling of her fate. That was a potent statement about identity, sovereignty, and the power of the last act to define a life. Octavian entered Alexandria after agreements and bargaining had unfolded, and his triumph in Rome would ultimately be built on this final capitulation. He ordered a display of spoils and symbols of victory that would be carried to the capital to bolster his image as restorer of peace and order. Yet the riches and relics he seized against Egyptian temples could not erase the cultural and political complexity of a kingdom that had long been a crucible of civilizations. Victory in war seldom simplifies the deeper currents that had long shaped a conquered land's identity. What endured from Cleopatra's reign was not merely the end of a dynasty but a demonstration of the interplay between personal charisma and hard politics. She had used beauty and theater as instruments, yes, but also money, fleets, and treaties, practical tools of statecraft. Her actions showed that in that age, as in ours, the realms of private passion and public policy were not separate. They fed into each other and often produced outcomes neither side anticipated. Cleopatra's life thus remained an instruction in the complexities of power. The Battle of Actium became a hinge in Mediterranean history, shifting supremacy toward Rome in a way that reshaped governance, culture, and commerce across the region. Rome's consolidation accelerated, and the political structures that emerged under Augustus, Octavian's new title, reconfigured provincial administration and military command. Economic flows redirected under Roman imperial needs, and authors and artists of the subsequent centuries would echo the conflict in plays, poems, and monuments. Actium was the mortal combat whose ripples touched systems far beyond the immediate participants. Yet even as Rome's shadow lengthened, Egyptian influence persisted in art, religion, and trade, and Alexandria continued to be a center of learning and commerce for centuries. Libraries and scholars would, for a time, keep the name of the city in intellectual memory, and the memory of Cleopatra lived on in countless retellings. The queen's image traveled across time and cultures, morphing into myth and metaphor, and writers would later paint her alternately as enchantress and victim, strategist and tragic heroine. Each retelling revealed more about the storyteller's world than perhaps about the historical woman herself. Military historians peered at Actium and found lessons in logistics and command that lasted beyond its era, the significance of supply chains, of coordinated fleets, and of the psychological impact of perception in war. Octavian's triumph had rested not just on slaughter but on the steady attrition of an enemy's resources, on blockade, and on local alliances that strangled opportunity. Agrippa's role underlined how technological savvy and seamanship could slant a campaign's outcome. Those were timeless insights for any age that watched ships and armies contend for dominance. In private households, the story of Cleopatra and Antony became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing duty with desire, of how political life could become intoxicated by personal relationships. Mothers and fathers told children how loyalties could shift and how leaders might be swayed by charm or flattery. Poets took those themes and made them universal, and philosophers used the tale to discuss virtue, moderation, and the perils of hubris. The narrative seeped into civic life as both entertainment and ethical lesson, adaptable and enduring. There was also the quieter record of the artisans, priests, and common folk who had lived under Cleopatra's rule and whose lives were altered by the campaign's ripple effects. Craftsmen who had been employed to outfit ships found their skills redirected to mending hulls or building stores for occupiers. Temple revenues were seized or redirected, and religious ceremonies modified to fit the new political reality. The human stories hidden beneath official chronicles showed how war remade social orders in small, inexorable ways. Cleopatra's legacy also prompted questions about the representation of women in power and how historians shaped those depictions with their own biases. Ancient chroniclers often emphasized seduction and excess, perhaps because those motifs were sensational and fit narratives about foreignness and threat. Modern scholarship has pushed back, arguing for a more nuanced reading that recognizes Cleopatra as a savvy ruler who used all the means available to her. The tension between mythic portrayal and political reality itself became an object of study. Even as scholars argued, artists painted and dramatists performed her life, each era reshaping her image to fit contemporary anxieties and fantasies. In some portrayals, she was the seductress who toppled civilizations, and in others, she was the tragic patriot who chose death over humiliation. These artistic reworkings turned a complex political figure into a mirror for societies that reflected their own gender politics, imperial ambitions, and anxieties about cultural contact. Cleopatra's story thus served as a canvas for others to project their values and fears. The intimate details of ships and soldiers at Actium remain subjects of fascination for those wanting to picture the battle more vividly. Archaeologists searched for wrecks, historians read dust-covered texts for hints, and naval enthusiasts reconstructed how oarsmen, marines, and officers would have lived aboard. The shipboard reality, stench, noise, cramped quarters, contrasted with the glossy images later propagandists promoted. Imagining those conditions made clear the physical toll of ancient naval warfare, the exhaustion and courage required to fight under such relentless conditions. Strategically, Actium revealed how control of the sea lanes and local harbors could change the course of empires. Whoever managed to protect supply convoys and intercept enemy logistics gained leverage that was sometimes more decisive than numerical superiority. The battle showcased the strategic depth that maritime control provided, enabling blockade, siege, and maneuver in ways land battles alone could not. For rulers who controlled the Mediterranean's arteries, the sea offered both opportunity and risk. On a personal level, Cleopatra's final decisions reflected a woman aware of legacy and conscience, who balanced love, ambition, and the brutal calculus of power. Whether her last acts were staged with theatrical concern or carried out with stoic privacy, they were chosen by a leader who had long understood the role of image in politics. The queen's control of her exit narrative was itself an assertion of sovereignty, even at the moment empire folded around her. It was an act meant to deny the enemy the final page of her story. After Actium, Rome's imperial story unfolded and the memory of Cleopatra became enmeshed in the narratives Octavian promoted. He fashioned himself as bringer of order after chaos, and the defeat of a royal couple who embodied Eastern extravagance fit his construction of Roman virtue. Monuments and coins memorialized his victory and helped shape a collective memory that justified a new political settlement. In that process, the complexities of the defeated were flattened into symbols the victor could display and explain to a diverse population. Yet historical memory never fully silenced the nuances, and other voices persisted: letters, papyri, and local chronicles that registered the subtler impacts of the conflict. Administrative records showed changes in taxation, in land ownership, and in the legal status of communities that altered everyday life more than any single headline. The long-term consequences of Actium were often bureaucratic and incremental, marked by new governance patterns and economic realignments that took generations to settle. The transformation was not instantaneous but continuous. Cleopatra's Egypt did not vanish into oblivion, rather it was absorbed into a larger imperial system that borrowed Egyptian elements and repurposed them. Rome adopted Egyptian cults in some places and adapted administrative techniques for provincial rule. The crossing of cultural practices between a dominant and a subject power created a hybrid world, where coins, language, and religious syncretism mingled. Cleopatra, in death, remained part of that interchange, an emblem of a world in which cultures collided and rewired one another. In the centuries that followed, the Battle of Actium continued to be invoked whenever rulers sought to demonstrate the decisive power of a single blow to alter history. It became shorthand for a turning point, a moment when a struggling polity gave ground and a new order asserted itself. Military thinkers examined it for the lessons of coordination and command, and poets used it for metaphorical purposes, showing how love and power could be entangled with ruin. The image of two lovers at odds with an empire remained rich soil for reflection. For students of strategy, Actium served as a case study in how the interplay of sea power, logistics, and propaganda could topple a coalition. Octavian's careful manipulation of public opinion, his ability to maintain steady supply lines, and Agrippa's naval maneuvering together produced a victory that was more than brute force. Conversely, Antony and Cleopatra's failure to secure unwavering support and to adapt tactics to their opponents' strengths demonstrated how internal disunity could be fatal. Those lessons echoed in military academies and studies for centuries afterward. Cleopatra's life and the Battle of Actium also compelled writers to ask harder questions about agency and fate, about how much any individual can influence the currents of history. She made bold choices and paid a price, yet she altered the narrative of an age simply by daring to act on larger stages. Antony, too, was not merely a pawn, he was a powerful actor whose decisions helped determine outcomes. Their story invites reflection on the interplay between personal choice and structural forces that make certain events seem inevitable in hindsight. As centuries peeled away, artists and dramatists continued to return to the drama for its raw, human elements: love, betrayal, courage, and ruin. Each era remade Cleopatra according to its ways of seeing women and power, and the queen remained a versatile symbol in Western culture. She could be fashioned into a villain to justify imperial conquest or reconstructed as a heroine resisting it. That multiplicity of portraiture ensured she would remain alive in imagination, not merely in dusty archives. In modern times, the search for the physical remains of the battle and the royal palaces took on the twin aspects of scholarship and romance, as archaeologists combed the seafloor and shorelines for relics. Discoveries of anchors, pottery, and coins added texture to ancient narratives, but they also reminded readers that history was built on fragmentary evidence. The past revealed itself in shards and whispers, and careful work could resuscitate details that made the grand story feel human and immediate. Each find gave a heartbeat to a city drowned in the grand sweep of imperial change. The ongoing fascination with Cleopatra and Actium also revealed how history could be a conversation across ages, with each generation asking new questions and bringing new methods to old material. Literary scholars asked about narrative bias, archaeologists dug into the mud of harbors, and cultural historians read the myths we spun as meaningful in themselves. Together, these approaches painted a fuller portrait of a conflict that was strategic and deeply personal, a collision of empires and hearts. What remained undeniable was the drama of a queen who attempted to navigate an ancient world's most perilous currents. Cleopatra's life intersected with Rome at the height of its creative violence, and in that crossing she exercised power, staged spectacle, and made choices that would echo for millennia. Whether admired or maligned, she compelled attention and forced others to rearrange themselves in response to her actions. Her story was war and intrigue distilled into human terms, an enduring testament to the complexity of leadership. At the core of the Battle of Actium lay a study in contrasts, disciplined engineering against flamboyant largesse, Roman administrative ruthlessness against Egyptian ceremonial resilience. A commander who favored maneuver against one who favored mass. Those contrasts made the outcome highly contingent on small decisions, on weather and wind, on the loyalty of sailors and the resolve of captains. In war, often the smallest hinge swings the largest door, and Actium's hinge stood on the sea's surface and the minds of those who looked upon it. Time has not simplified the emotions wrapped around the battle. If anything, it has enriched the texture of interpretation. We can see Cleopatra alternately as opportunist and patriot, Antony as fool and tragic hero, Octavian as savior of Rome and harbinger of empire. These contradictions make the narrative alive, resisting tidy moral verdicts and inviting listeners to consider the interplay of motives and consequences. The saga thus remains a living story, refusing a single, absolute reading. To listen to Cleopatra's tale is to hear the sound of wars and of trumpets, of sea birds and of distant drums, a chorus that united public spectacle and private terror. The ancient world was loud with such sounds, and the Battle of Actium carried all of them as evidence of a decisive moment. The queen's voice, whether in speeches or in the ritual language of the temples, survives in fragments of memory and in the imagination of those who retell her story. That is why, centuries later, her name still carries the weight it always did. Ultimately, the story of Cleopatra and Actium is not confined to facts and dates alone. It is an exploration of how human ambitions collide and sometimes combust. It shows how alliances can be both shields and chains, how perception can be as deadly as the sword, and how the sea can both deliver and betray. Cleopatra's life embodied these lessons in their most dramatic form, and for listeners traversing highways or quiet rooms, the tale offers both a caution and a marvel about the costs of power. Listening to their story offers a lesson in empathy too, for behind every commander and queen were humans with frailties and fierce loyalties. Antony wept for lost causes and misread loyalties. Cleopatra measured the calculus of survival with a ruler's cold arithmetic, and Octavian navigated the moral compromises of a man building a new world order. The human depth of these figures elevates the Battle of Actium from a historical event to a mirror of universal struggles between love, duty, and ambition. And so, as the Mediterranean settled after the storm, as trade resumed and children played along the shores where once oars had scratched furious arcs, the echoes of that contest remained. Statues toppled and temples were repurposed, but the stories persisted, retold in new languages and on new stages. The queen's choices and the sailor's bravery became part of a repertoire of human stories retold to teach, to warn, and to inspire. In that continuing retelling, Cleopatra and Actium remained eternally relevant. She arrives in memory like a tide coming in on a moonlit shore, not as a single moment but as a succession of images that wash over one another. You may know a few facts at the edges of your mind, names and dates and portrayals from stage and screen, but what lingers is the feeling of someone who refused to be reduced to any one story. Cleopatra reappears in history as both sovereign and symbol, as political actor and as a canvas upon which others painted their fears and fantasies. To understand her is to follow a braided thread of politics, culture, rumor, and reinvention stretching across centuries. Her birth belongs to a dynasty that was already foreign to the land it ruled, yet deeply intertwined with its fate. The Ptolemaic line had been founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, a Macedonian ruling over an Egyptian world that was older than the palace stones. Cleopatra was both heir to that military legacy and acolyte of Egypt's long civilizational memory. She learned to speak Egyptian and to perform rites that connected her to gods older than the dynastic names she bore. In that combination lay the curious power she would wield, the ability to move between languages, rituals, and alliances with an ease that unsettled those who preferred rigid categories. Imagine Alexandria as a living map of contradictions, a city both Greek and Egyptian, cosmopolitan and fiercely local, built by design to be a mirror of the Mediterranean world. Its library and lighthouse were symbols of human ambition, a place where scholars argued about philosophy and sailors loaded grain bound for Rome. Cleopatra walked that city as its ruler and its peer, reigning from a throne in which the world and the Nile converged. She maintained Alexandria not merely as a seat of power but as a stage on which she could enact rulership in ways that were visible to the world. Politics in her time was a matter of immediate danger and improvisation, where alliances were made and broken in a single season. Cleopatra came to power at a moment when Ptolemaic Egypt was fraying at its edges, threatened by internal family rivalries and the inexorable expansion of Roman power. She proved to be quick and decisive, aligning with Rome's strongest men not out of romance alone but out of strategic necessity. That blending of personal relationship and political calculation would be her hallmark and also the seed of later scandal. Her relationship with Julius Caesar began as many political relationships do, with a meeting whose details have been embroidered by history. Rome offered both protection and peril. Caesar provided her a foothold to return to power after a dangerous exile. Their bond produced both a son and a political realignment, with Cleopatra asserting her status not just as allied ruler but as mother of a child with the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. This alliance, for all its intimacy, functioned above all as a means to secure Egypt and its sovereignty in a world increasingly dominated by Rome. The assassination of Caesar unseated that temporary balance, and the aftershocks reached Alexandria like distant thunder. Cleopatra found herself confronting a Rome now split and in the throes of civil war, and she made the tactical decision to support Mark Antony, who held the eastern provinces and who, like Caesar, appreciated Egypt's resources and her own shrewd capacities. The relationship that followed was public theater and private alliance, a partnership that shaped the course of empires. With Antony she traveled the eastern seas, shared crowns, and negotiated power in a manner both regal and dangerously visible. The romance of their lives has been distilled into images of sumptuous banquets and protracted embraces, but the reality was also bureaucratic and brutal. They negotiated treaties and distributed territories, they planned fleets and hammered out finances. Cleopatra's input into these affairs was not ornamental. She provided ships, treasure, and diplomatic networks, and she used the rituals of kingship to bolster Antony's image among Eastern subjects. That blending of the ceremonial and the transactional made their partnership formidable, and it made them enemies in Rome who saw a rival coalition forming that might fracture Roman dominance. Augustus, then still Octavian, understood the danger and turned the story into a weapon. He painted Cleopatra as a foreign seductress whose influence over Antony threatened the purity of Roman politics and family values. In many ways, his propaganda worked precisely because it repurposed ancient anxieties about foreigners and royal women into a simple narrative of treachery. The Battle of Actium, naval and psychological, became the decisive moment. What followed was not only military defeat but the unmaking of a partnership that had aimed to reorder the Mediterranean. The days that followed Actium were a collapse of illusions and a reconfiguration of power. Antony, abandoned by many of his allies and misled by reports, retreated to Alexandria where Cleopatra's fate and his own became inseparable. They both faced a future of captivity or death, and in that final hour their choices were both theatrical and private. Ancient sources, particularly those sympathetic to Rome's victors, described their deaths with an eye for symbolism and moralizing, and so Cleopatra's end was narrated into an image that would haunt later storytellers. The story of her death is wrapped in a glamour of myth, the ASP, the perfumed garland, the velvet room. Yet beneath that dramatization lies a sober sequence of decisions made by a ruler who refused to be paraded as a trophy. If she did choose suicide, it was an act of sovereignty meant to prevent the indignity of display and to control, in her last breath, the terms of her disappearance. Whether by venom or by other means, the moment of her passing would be written and rewritten to fit the needs of those telling the tale. Each retelling added a layer to her legend even as it claimed to explain her motives. In the aftermath, Rome absorbed Egypt directly and with it the enormous wealth of the Nile. Augustus reclad himself in the image of the restorer of order and used the narrative of his victory to cement authority at home. Cleopatra, by contrast, was transformed by Roman writers into a cautionary tale, a foreign queen who, by mixing desire and statecraft, endangered the Roman world. Yet even as those accounts sought to diminish her, they ensured that she would live on in the Roman imagination, a figure both exotic and explanatory of Roman triumph. Across centuries, artists and writers remixed her image to serve their own eras and purposes. Medieval chroniclers often forgot the nuance of Hellenistic politics, and when they remembered Cleopatra, they remembered her as a monstrous seductress or a tragic lover. The Renaissance revived classical texts, and with them a renewed interest in her as both an object of desire and a cautionary figure. Each period projected its anxieties onto her, turning her into a screen upon which debates about gender, power, and foreignness played out. The early modern period found in Cleopatra a subject of stagecraft, a role for actors to explore the boundaries between female authority and masculine ambition. From Elizabethan theaters to later salon dramas, her image evolved with performance practices and with the political climates in which those plays were staged. Sometimes she became a mirror for queens and stateswomen of later ages, an ambiguous model of female rulership. The persistent fascination said less about her life alone than about the enduring questions of how power and femininity could coexist without destabilizing social orders. Cleopatra's physical appearance, too, has been a battleground of interpretation. Coins bearing her likeness show a profile that is often described as strong, aquiline, and resolute rather than classically beautiful in the later sense. Portraits and sculptures reveal not the languid seductress of romantic imagining but a woman who could convey gravity and command. The discrepancy between historical likenesses and later eroticized images speaks to the distance between her lived personhood and the fantasies that accreted around her. Language was one of her tools of rule and connection. She was reportedly the first Ptolemaic ruler to speak Egyptian, a fact that signified something deeper than mere linguistic fluency. It showed a willingness to engage with Egyptian institutions and religious cults on their own terms, to embrace the visual and ritual language of the land she governed. Speaking Egyptian, as ancient chroniclers emphasized, allowed her to bridge cultural divides and to be seen not solely as a foreign Hellenistic queen but as a pharaoh in touch with the Nile and its people. Culturally, she inhabited a crossroads where Greek philosophy, Egyptian theology, and the cosmopolitan life of the Mediterranean intersected. Alexandria itself was a laboratory of syncretism, where scholars translated texts between tongues and where religious cults borrowed imagery and rites from one another. Cleopatra moved within that space as both high priest and monarch, using religious presence as part of regal legitimacy. She participated in rituals and took titles that tied her identity to both the Greek ruling house and the sacral framework of Egyptian kingship. Her image on coinage and statues was deliberate and political, crafted to project continuity and sovereignty. Coins were circulated widely and carried her portrait into the hands of subjects, traders, and soldiers. Like all monarchs, she needed the public face of rulership to be consistent and recognizable, to reassure those who needed the daily predictability of taxes, grain distributions, and legal order. That image also served to communicate signals to foreign powers, to advertise stability and strength at a glance. The economy of Egypt under her rule mattered in practical ways for the politics of the Mediterranean. The Nile's grain sustained entire populations and underwrote the wealth that allowed rulers to maintain armies and fleets. Cleopatra managed fiscal resources and diplomatic relationships that kept ships afloat and alliances viable. Rome's appetite for Egyptian grain made the country a prize to be fought over, and Cleopatra had to navigate the pressures that came from being both provider and target in the regional economy. Her children, born into the messy intersections of royal houses and Roman politics, became living symbols of contested claims. Whether through Caesar or Antony, her offspring were raised with titles and expectations that mirrored the ambitions of their parents. They would be bargaining chips in the games of marriage and alliance, and their fates were bound up with the fortunes of empires. The language used to describe them by Roman writers often reflected more of Rome's anxieties than the private realities of their upbringing. Religious motifs in her life deserve attention not only for their ceremonial value but for how they underwrote political legitimacy. By taking on titles and participating in cults, she asserted continuity with a lineage of rulers who claimed divine favor. That was not mere theater. In an ancient world where gods were invoked in treaties and names were inscribed on temple walls, sacral recognition could placate subjects and legitimize taxation and labor. Cleopatra's public religious roles helped to bind diverse communities to a centralized power. The role of women in Hellenistic courts is often misapprehended by modern readers who overlay contemporary notions of gender on ancient systems. Royal women were not merely ornaments of ambition, they were agents in diplomacy, patrons of culture, and mediators in domestic succession disputes. Cleopatra embodied many of these roles at once. She negotiated treaties, managed estates, and intervened in dynastic struggles. Reading her actions through the narrow lens of romantic intrigue obscures the fuller reality of a woman operating within and reshaping the political frameworks available to her. Octavian's victory and the Roman takeover of Egypt rewrote the geopolitical map, but it also transformed Cleopatra's image into a cautionary tale for posterity. In Roman art and literature that celebrated imperial order, she appeared as the foil whose exoticism justified expansion and control. Yet even those depictions could not entirely erase the traces of her capacity for statecraft. Her life continued to resonate because it represented a collision between two worlds and an alternative way of exercising power. The archaeology of her era offers fragments that spark both clarity and speculation. Excavations in Alexandria and beyond have turned up coins, seals, and inscriptions that confirm administrative practices and trade patterns, but the presence of Alexandria itself, its architecture, its lost library, casts a long shadow. Modern archaeologists dig into layers of time that often conflate the Ptolemaic with later Roman strata, and each find is a headline in the ongoing conversation about what it meant to rule Egypt at the world's crossroads. Material culture anchors some of the narratives, even as much remains open to interpretation. Over time, the tale of Cleopatra has been reshaped by colonizers and nationalists with competing stakes in her portrayal. In European imagination, she often became the exotic other, a caution against the dangers of Eastern sensuality. In Egyptian nationalism, she could be reclaimed as a symbol of ancient glory and resistance. Those competing appropriations reveal less about her personal motives than about the needs of later societies to find heroes or monsters to justify their own present circumstances. In that sense, her afterlives are mirrors that show each era's anxieties back at itself. Film and theater of the modern era did more than entertain. They codified images of Cleopatra that persist today. From early silent epics to mid-century Hollywood spectacles, staging and costume design painted her in broad, often Orientalist strokes. Actresses who played her were tasked not just with creating a character, but with carrying forward a set of cultural assumptions about race, gender, and power. Those performances, for better and worse, fixed her in the public imagination as an archetype as much as a historical figure. A feminist reinterpretation in the 20th and 21st centuries reclaimed aspects of her story that earlier narratives had dismissed. Scholars and writers began to emphasize her political acumen, her multilingualism, and her active role in statecraft rather than focusing solely on romance. Feminists argued that portraying her primarily as a seductress ignored the structural constraints she navigated and the agency she exercised. In this reframing, she becomes not merely a lover of powerful men, but a ruler whose methods deserve the same analytical rigor as those used for any male contemporary. At the same time, debates about race and identity complicate how she is represented today. Questions about her ancestry, skin color, and whether she looked more Macedonian, Egyptian, or a blend of Mediterranean types persist among enthusiasts and scholars. The evidence is fragmentary and contested, and modern politicized readings sometimes impose neat categories that an ancient Mediterranean world did not. Instead of settling a single answer, the debate about her appearance often reveals modern preoccupations with identity and belonging. Cleopatra's name began to function as a literary shorthand for a certain kind of political danger, and that shorthand could be deployed by writers across the political spectrum. Poets, novelists, and playwrights used her as a symbol of decline, seduction, or tragic nobility depending on their audience and intentions. When a society wanted to dramatize the fall of rulers undone by passion and foreign influence, her story offered a compact, recognizable template. Yet the richness of the historical record resists such compression, and careful readers can find complexities that the shorthand excludes. Her patronage of the arts and sciences in Alexandria anchors another dimension of her legacy. Cleopatra lived in a city where scholarship and curiosity were publicly celebrated, and rulers often supported schools, libraries, and scholars to cement their cultural credentials. The intermingling of royal favor and intellectual life fueled projects of translation, classification, and discovery that shaped Mediterranean knowledge. While much of Alexandria's renowned scholarship has been lost to time, the traces we have point to an environment in which a cultivated monarch could meaningfully influence the intellectual currents of her age. Consider also the everyday life of the people under her rule, a world that rarely makes it into grand narratives. Farmers tended fields irrigated by the Nile's rhythms, artisans shaped pottery and jewelry, and merchants moved grain and goods along trade routes. Her policies affected tax collection, grain distribution, and local governance in ways that had direct impact on daily survival and prosperity. The macro-political dramas often overshadow the practicalities of rulership, but they were inseparable. Decisions made in palaces filtered down to marketplaces and fields. Over the long arc of history, Cleopatra's story also offers a lesson in how myths are manufactured. The ancient writers who shaped her image were not neutral chroniclers. They were participants in political life and had reasons to craft stories that bolstered the status quo. Their biases, in turn, informed medieval retellings and Renaissance adaptations, so that each layer of retelling added embellishment and sometimes outright invention. To read Cleopatra is to practice skepticism and imagination at once, parsing the motives behind each account while piecing together the texture that remains. New scholarship in fields like papyrology, epigraphy, and numismatics has opened windows into previously obscure corners of the Ptolemaic bureaucracy. Documents on papyrus reveal contracts, tax records, and private letters that reconfigure assumptions about administration and daily law. Coins, with the iconography of rulers and inscriptions, allow historians to track political messages and economic health across reigns. These material traces complicate the image of Cleopatra as merely a dramatic figure and anchor her in the administrative realities of ruling a complex, multi-ethnic state. The question of Cleopatra's intelligence is less a query about IQ and more about a ruler's capacity to read situations and act decisively. Her multilingualism and diplomatic instincts were practical tools that gave her an advantage in negotiations. She understood theater and spectacle as tools of governance, using processions, ceremonies, and carefully staged encounters to craft perception. Intelligence, in this sense, is visible in the ways she mobilized culture, finance, and alliances to maintain a fragile sovereignty. Her use of ritual and pageantry was not mere vanity but a form of political communication. When she presented herself to foreign allies, she did so in a context designed to speak to those viewers' expectations and to assert her own legitimacy. That performative knowledge is part of a long tradition of rulership where image and ceremony operate alongside force. The skill lay in calibrating those displays so they could persuade armies, merchants, and local elites to align with her interests. Cleopatra's personal style and material culture have spawned empires of fascination. Perfumes, cosmetics, jewelry, and garments all become part of the lore around her. Writings about her luxurious tastes often became shorthand for moralizing judgments, but they also point to a ruler who understood the semiotics of luxury. In a pre-industrial economy, displays of wealth signaled not only personal taste but the capacity to mobilize resources and reward loyalty. Adorning a court with fine objects formed a visible network of obligation and power. Her afterlife in the arts has been a site of redefinition and contestation. Painters have depicted her in 1,000 moods: defiant queen, despairing mother, cunning seductress, noble tragic figure. Each painting captures a particular cultural temperament, the sensual interest of the Baroque, the moralizing stance of the neoclassical, the fascination with the exotic and Victorian sensibilities. These visual iterations turn her into a symbol that can be reshaped to address contemporary aesthetic and moral questions. Cleopatra's encounters with Rome also illuminate the asymmetries of empire and the mechanisms through which power consolidates. Rome could tolerate client kingdoms when they supplemented Roman influence, but once a client appeared too powerful or too independent, the center moved to absorb or neutralize the threat. Egypt's tribute and grain were strategic resources Rome could not ignore, and Cleopatra's maneuvers to preserve autonomy inevitably drew imperial scrutiny. That tension between localized sovereignty and imperial appetite defined much of the Hellenistic world's fate. The legal frameworks of the time, while very different from modern law, mattered for succession and legitimacy. Dynastic claims rested on a mix of hereditary principle, military support, and religious sanction. Cleopatra negotiated all of these elements with a pragmatic eye, understanding when to press claims and when to concede. Her legal standing as ruler was less a static inheritance than an ongoing performance of authority, constructed through marriages, decrees, and public acts. The role of memory and commemoration shaped how later generations read her life. Roman propaganda erased or repackaged inconvenient dimensions of her rule while accentuating others, creating a foundation for centuries of interpretation. Monuments that survived, inscriptions that endured, and coins kept her visage in circulation even as narratives shifted. The durable materials of monuments and the paper of texts both contributed to a layered archive from which historians and storytellers would draw. Her mythic presence extended beyond Europe into broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern imaginaries, which read her through different cultural lenses. Eastern sources sometimes preserved a more ambivalent view, acknowledging both her capability and her cosmopolitan identity. The multiplicity of perspectives underscores how cross-cultural exchanges produce diverse receptions rather than a single, universal image. Cleopatra thus inhabits multiple memoryscapes simultaneously, each one revealing different facets of her significance. The modern scholar working on Cleopatra faces an abundance of sources that are partial, contradictory, and often written by outsiders. She is documented in Greek and Roman histories, in inscriptions, in coins, and in material remains, but rarely in self-authored texts. The historian's craft becomes an exercise in triangulation, weighing papyrus fragments against coinage, reconciling Roman propaganda with Egyptian administrative documents, and reading between the lines to recover motives and constraints. This methodological complexity is part of what makes her study endlessly generative. Her name continues to be invoked in conversations about female leadership with both admiration and ambivalence. She is sometimes held up as an exemplar of cunning and adaptability, and at other times as a warning about the mingling of charisma and politics. Contemporary discussions about women in power often wrestle with similar double standards she encountered. Agency is admired when it aligns with expectation and condemned when it upends established orders. In that sense, her life offers a long mirror to current debates about gender and authority. Popular culture recycles and revises her in ways that reveal as much about the present as about the past. Television series and streaming dramas retell her story with modern sensibilities, sometimes emphasizing her independence, sometimes falling back on sensationalized narratives. These retellings can be liberating in their attempt to center her voice, but they can also perpetuate simplistic tropes by insisting she must be either victim or villain. The creative reinventions are themselves part of the ongoing biography she refuses to let remain closed. The archaeology of individual artifacts associated with her reign continues to produce small revolutions in understanding. A newly found inscription might clarify a title, a previously private letter might illuminate a tax policy, a coin hoard could shift ideas about economic stress. Each discovery is a reminder that history is not a fixed monument but an active conversation between present and past. Cleopatra's life remains open to reinterpretation precisely because the material record keeps offering surprises. Her relationship to Egyptian religion and iconography also complicates the simplistic reading of her as merely Hellenistic. She embraced Egyptian titles and was portrayed in some contexts with the regalia of native pharaohs, a move that signaled her desire to be accepted as Egypt's legitimate ruler in both cultural and religious terms. This cultural fluency made her rule more resilient among local populations, who recognized not just the coat of a foreign house but the substance of pharaonic continuity. That adaptability was a political resource shaped by centuries of local expectations. The context of Mediterranean trade illuminates another side of her power: control over ports, fleets, and commercial networks. Alexandria was a hub where goods flowed from Africa, Asia, and Europe, and controlling those flows meant access to wealth and influence. Maintaining that network required diplomatic skill and occasional military enforcement, and Cleopatra's reign involved constant navigation of commercial alliances. Trade was not an abstract economic category, it was the bloodstream of geopolitical influence in her age. Her story also prompts reflection on the nature of biography itself. How do we write the life of someone who lived so long ago when surviving evidence is selective and often shaped by enemies? Biographers of Cleopatra must balance narrative momentum with evidentiary caution, weaving together administrative details with larger cultural contexts and psychological conjectures carefully framed. The craft of writing about her life always involves telling a story while acknowledging the provisional nature of the evidence. In museums and classrooms, she remains a figure of fascination, her life condensed into timelines and portraits that invite deeper questions. Students encounter her often as a dramatic headline in textbooks, and that encounter can either flatten her complexity or spark curiosity about the world she inhabited. Educators who teach her life can use it as a gateway to discuss wider themes: empire, gender, cultural exchange, and the production of historical memory. Her story thus becomes a teaching tool as well as a subject in its own right. The language of diplomacy that she employed resonates with modern statesmanship: alliances made through marriages, gifts, public rituals, and negotiated treaties. Her methods were a mixture of realpolitik and symbolic communication, an approach still recognizable in the mechanics of modern international relations. Even though the instruments have changed, the logic of alliance building, create mutual benefit, project strength, manage perception, remains familiar. Cleopatra's playbook, in that sense, offers a distant echo of the way states still conduct themselves. Her children's fates after her death were emblematic of how individual lives are often subsumed by the politics of empire. They were paraded in Rome and then assimilated into the social fabric of the victors in a manner that stripped them of any dynastic threat. Their names remain footnotes in the narrative of imperial consolidation, reminders of how quickly new regimes sought to neutralize competing claims. Those outcomes reflect a broader pattern in ancient politics where the survival of a lineage depended on the caprices of war and favor. Cleopatra also left imprints in ways that are subtle rather than monumental: a coin here, a local inscription there, a rumor that caught fire and never died. These small relics contribute to a larger sense of presence that refuses to be fully extinguished by conquest. The durability of her image stems not from any single triumph, but from a cumulative series of acts that kept her name circulating in multiple languages and forms. That persistence allowed later societies to reconfigure her story for their own purposes, an invitation that has been accepted again and again. In thinking about Cleopatra's life, you meet contradictions that refuse easy resolution: sovereign who loved, lover who ruled, foreigner who adopted native rights. Those tensions are the heart of her story and the reason she still fascinates. She exemplifies a kind of power that is improvisational, performative, and deeply embedded in cultural sign systems. To follow her life is to watch how authority is made in real time, in speech and ceremony and calculation, under conditions of risk and opportunity. The legend of Cleopatra has also been a springboard for creative reinterpretation in novels, operas, and even video games, each medium extracting different energies from her narrative. Novelists may dwell on interiority and psychological nuance, composers emphasize drama and tragic arc, game designers harness the political strategy of her age for interactive play. Each medium frames her with different affordances, and in doing so reveals fresh possibilities for engagement with her life story. The multiplicity of forms keeps her relevant in a world that continually invents new ways to tell old tales. Her life prompts us to consider how we evaluate leadership across cultural divides. Do we judge ancient figures by contemporary standards, or do we try to inhabit the logic of their own moment? This question matters when assessing the choices she made in alliances, displays, and governance. The historian's task is not to excuse but to situate, to see actions as responses to structural constraints and opportunities rather than as mere expressions of personality. Cleopatra's decisions make more sense when read against the pressures of her time. Even the myths of Cleopatra's luxuries hide practical purposes. Elaborate banquets and opulent palaces were not only pleasures but tools of statecraft designed to cement loyalties and display resources. In a world where spectacle equaled legitimacy, those displays had functional outcomes. They reassured allies, impressed rivals, and maintained the loyalty of those who might otherwise be tempted to defect. Luxury was thus convertible into political capital, a form of soft power that worked alongside more coercive measures. Her death and the immediate Roman victory led to an era of Pax Romana in which Augustus consolidated power and reorganized the ways the empire administered distant provinces. Egypt became a personal domain of the emperor, managed differently from other territories because of its strategic and economic importance. In that transformation, Cleopatra's world ceased to exist as an independent political actor, but her story remained a powerful moral and rhetorical device for the new regime. The absorption of her kingdom into imperial structures reshaped the Mediterranean for centuries to come. Modern readers sometimes seek a definitive portrait of Cleopatra, the cunning conspirator, the tragic heroine, the brilliant stateswoman. But she resists such singularity because she inhabited a liminal and performative space where roles shifted according to need and audience. That polyphony is her most enduring lesson. Power does not exist in a vacuum, and the masks of rule are many. Listening to her life is to encounter a set of strategies that survived through the ancient world's noise, and that continue to speak to us across millennia. As the centuries unfolded, historians, artists, and publics have kept returning to her not simply out of fascination with an individual but because her life condenses big historical questions into a small, vivid narrative. She epitomizes the encounter between old orders and rising empires, between cultural syncretism and political consolidation. Her story forces us to reckon with how identity, performance, and authority are manufactured and contested. For listeners today, her life offers both thrilling drama and a case study in the perennial mechanics of power. To end is to recognize that she never truly left public consciousness. She shifted shapes and continued to speak in unexpected ways. Whether invoked in political rhetoric, retold on stage, or studied in archives, Cleopatra persists as a figure who bridges worlds and epochs. Her legend endures because it contains within it the essential ingredients of compelling narrative, ambition, risk, theatricality, and a tragic end that provokes more questions than answers. In that open-endedness lies the reason she will likely continue to fascinate generations who, like the tides, return again and again to the Alexandria she once ruled. Her legend crosses time. Subscribe and share in the comments. Do you find Cleopatra more fascinating for her power and ambition or for the mystery and tragedy that surround her?